Reborn. Evolving from Nothing Chapters 211 to 220. Chapter 211 End. Several hours later, Dorian sat down next to Helena's bed as she rested, looking at her with only a small hint of worry. The reassurances he'd received from the Shade King that she would wake soon had calmed him, but he couldn't help how he felt. He sighed, rubbing his forehead slightly. "We've got a lot to do, Smalls," he muttered, looking at her wryly. He had successfully managed to convince the Shade King to at least attempt a ceasefire using the two of them. After his attempt at convincing the Shade King succeeded, the powerful ruler had finally explained to Dorian why everything was happening. It had to do with a core secret that very, very few people were aware of. It had to do with the origins of the Shade race. The Shades were the descendants of an ancient race known as the Shadwar. The Shadwar were far more attributed to darkness and shadow, creatures that could slip into a distorted realm of shadow to move about, hiding from the real world. Their ability was kind of similar to that of 15's Greymander form, except that the realm of shadow they traversed was still part of the 30,000 worlds, and therefore detectable. The Shadwar were extremely strong. They lived as rulers back in the ancient times when the dragon race reigned supreme and the demon race was only starting to come active, many tens of thousands of years ago. The number of Shadwar dwindled as time went on. Not from dangerous wars or traitors attacking their kind, however. They were a reclusive race that fiercely defended their territory, but also stayed to themselves, refusing to travel or even talk with other Shadwar. As a result, their numbers dwindled simply because very few Shadwar ever came into existence. As their population fell, it became apparent that the Shadwar race was likely to disappear from this world. Their numbers were simply too few to be sustainable for longer than a few thousand years. One of the leaders of the Shadwar, the Wiseman Shanoa, came up with an idea to address this. Even if the Shadwar were to fall, their descendants must flourish. It was impossible to change the nature of the Shadwar, and even if they could, it was likely too late. Instead, he came up with the genius plan to create an entire species of descendants, directly related to them. He decided that the descendants must be populous and widespread, unlike the solitary nature of Shadwar that had doomed their kind. Their descendants would carry on the glory of the Shadwar, bearing their strength and affinity for darkness and shadow. As a result, eventually, the Shade race was born, from the meticulous work of the greatest wizards and researchers of the Shadwar race. However, the Shadwar, again, were naturally reclusive. Their trust for even each other was low, and their trust for other races was non-existent. The Shade race was destined to overwhelm them in numbers. What if they eventually turned on their creators? The thought, itself, might be seen as a foolish or pointless one to those looking from afar, especially considering that the Shadwar race was already dying, but to the arrogant and reclusive Shadwar, it was a serious concern. Even with their dying grasp, they would refuse to release the reins and grant their descendants free control of their destinies. Thus, the wizards included a failsafe, a way to control the Shade race, should it ever be necessary. They figured that if it was never needed, then it would go forever unused. If the Shadwar died out before anything happened, then the failsafe would never be necessary and their descendants would be fine. This failsafe was known as the Desecration Curse. The Shador's wizardry, when it came to shadow and darkness magic, was incredibly complex. The Desecration Curse arose from this, a built-in defect that, when activated, slowly transformed a Shade's soul into that of a Shadowmonger. A Shadowmonger was a type of being that lived in the realm of shadow. They could not exist outside of the realm of shadow. They were instinctual creatures that had little intelligence and very short lifespans. They would die after only a few years, while new Shadowmongers were magically created by the laws of the universe shortly after. If a Shade's soul fully transformed into that of a Shadowmonger, unless they moved into the realm of shadow, their body and soul would degenerate. Their bones would grow brittle while their muscles and skin grew rough and stone-like. Even their organs would harden as their soul rejected life in the 30,000 worlds proper. Within months to years, depending on how powerful the original Shade had been, their body would seal itself completely. Their soul would leave and their body would turn to stone, killing them. The Desecration Curse was the ultimate fail-safe left behind by the Shadwar race. It was never intended to activate on its own. And yet, apparently, it had, for reasons even the Shades were unaware of. It was postulated by some to have activated automatically due to various errors that accumulated over time as the Shade race flourished. Some thought it might be a vindictive Shadwar or someone that found out how to activate the curse, trying to wipe out the Shades. The exact how wasn't known, but more than 100 years ago, it was discovered that several Shades had suffered from the desecration curse. At first, the incidents happened to only a few. They gradually increased in number as time went on until the relatively newly formed Church of Light stepped in, alongside the Shade Monarchy. Using incredible magic and expensive artifacts created by a crack team of the most elite Shade wizards, a way to temporarily stave off the desecration curse was discovered. A huge, massive magic spell that encompassed the entire race, forcibly stopping the spread of the curse. This spell lasted dozens of years. In that time, King Hasith broke into the angelic class, training like a maniac as he did everything he could to ensure the survival of his race. Huge teams of hundreds of thousands of Shades worked on various solutions, all trying to crack the puzzle that was the desecration curse. Eventually, after years and years and years of effort, a lead was found. An origin point for the desecration curse. An area that held some type of key clue to stopping the desecration curse. And that origin point was discovered to be located on none other than the world of Eternal Evening, Evening, the headquarters of the Aurelius family. The Shades and the Aurelius family were already on poor terms. There was no feasible way they could see to convince the Aurelius family to give up on their most secure homeworld, nor was there a chance of them letting the hundreds of thousands of Shade wizards set up shop and get to researching on the planet. Telling the vampires about the desecration curse was also a non-option. Even the various researchers working on the curse were not aware of the big picture, 99% believing it to be a rather dangerous type of disease that they were working to quash instead of a surefire apocalyptic killer. Even the Shadow Dukes were unaware of the truth. The Shades had done a great job disguising the full truth, even among their own kind. Some Shades certainly found the large manpower put towards defeating the curse unusual, but with the altruistic Church of Light at the helm, it was generally accepted and not an issue. Thus, the Shades were left with few options. Their only real one was to invade. And so, the various wars between the Shades and the vampires took place. When Dorian learned all of this, he had felt overwhelmed. He now understood why the Shade King had been so reluctant to tell him anything or give him any responsibility. This was a secret that related to the survival of trillions of innocent beings. The survival of the entire Shade race. He could see why the king had trouble trusting him with it. He took a deep breath and then let out. He then stood up and walked over to a comfortable-looking chair. They were at a new inn, the Golden Sheath Inn, an expensive and fancy establishment. After the long conversation with the Shade King, where Dorian successfully won him over, he and Helena had returned to the city proper. The room they were staying in was luxurious, with a large, comfortable-looking bed that Helena was resting on, silken curtains that blocked the windows, and a large couch and table in a living room-like area. Picturesque natural paintings decorated the walls, giving the place a very homey feel. The Moria Liberation Force had been reunited with him and moved over to the new inn, the previous inn suffering far too significant damages to be habitable. All fighting had ceased, including the mysterious battle that had been taking place overhead. He picked up a small golden necklace, pulling it from his spatial ring. The Shade King had given it to him. By using it, he could contact King Hasith himself. He was only to do so when he successfully found a way to negotiate and secure the survival of the Shade race. All I need to do now is convince the leadership of the Aurelius family to give up on their homeworld, or at least, agree to share it. He sighed again. It was bound to be a difficult task, even more so considering Kaladin had already left. The great hero had told Dorian he needed to prepare to fight against Ukelli now that he had returned and couldn't afford to wait any longer. He had set off almost immediately, vanishing just a few minutes after King Hasith left. After several hours of rest and meditation, Dorian felt 1,000 times better. His energy stores had been partially rejuvenated and the grueling exhaustion that had besieged him was nowhere to be found. The 5 to 6 hours of rest were more than enough, when combined with his excess growth energy, to get him back into fighting form. Speaking of growth energy, I have so many new bloodlines to experiment with. Tons of demonic ones. What will happen if I grow them all and combine them with my balanced demon form? A small bead of excitement formed in his heart. After all, the stronger he grew, the more influential he would become. Several more minutes passed in silence. It was dark outside, well into the night and on the way to early morning. Dorian split his focus between examining his new bloodlines and focusing on his new laws. He needed to gain a better foothold on each one, especially the big one, the law of original sin. If I merge enough bloodlines that are demonic, I feel like I might be able to make a form that can have an easier time studying the demonic laws. He rubbed his chin at the thought. His balanced demon form was already uniquely suited to studying laws in general, its powerful balanced state from its body of balance and soul of balance lending it great capabilities. As he was in the midst of planning, a light groan caught his attention. Dorian reacted almost instantaneously, his heart pounding as adrenaline pumped through him. On the bed in the back of the room, Helena's body slowly shifted as she came awake. "Helena," he whispered quietly, his eyes ecstatic as he rushed over. Dorian ego?" Helena caught herself mid-sentence as she looked at him groggily. "Yes, it's me." Without hesitation, Dorian carefully gathered her up in a huge hug, a few tears trailing from his eyes as a massive feeling of relief swept through him. "You're okay, ha ha ha, that's great." He laughed out loud as he ignored those tears, hugging her tightly. Helena seemed to freeze up for a moment before softly returning his hug. "What happened?" she whispered quietly. Dorian let go and cleared his throat, giving her a smile. "Well, quite a bit, actually." Almost half an hour later, Dorian finished explaining almost everything, though only after checking to make sure they weren't being spied on and covering them up in a layer of energy to block out sound. He told her about Moria and the expedition there, how he cleansed it and became a secretive member of the demonic council, about Kaladin, about 15, about Leader, about being a turkey, and about the problem with the shades. He hid almost nothing. He embellished the story a little, avoiding talking about the times where he was close to death, making it seem much safer than it was. Still, Helena was suitably impressed. She gasped when she heard about the demonic council members, Ood and Ahhed, as she heard him describe the fight with 15, laughed in delight when she heard about his warping turkey antics, and gained a serious look in her eyes when she heard about the plight of the shades. As a vampire, especially one that had seen a great deal of suffering due to the war with the shades, Helena naturally felt a certain level of animosity. When she heard that more than 1 trillion innocent beings had their lives at stake, however, that look in her eyes changed. Helena had been willing to risk her life to save a city that only had a small number of vampires in it and was mostly humans and other humanoids, back on Tapra. Of everyone that Dorian knew, she was the one most likely to be able to put aside her differences to protect the innocent, regardless of the cost to herself. It was just who she was. That is a serious problem. "And you said he trusted you, or rather, to resolve this entire war?" Her voice contained a hint of helplessness as she spoke, as if the task was impossible. "Yes, I know, especially with the injury to your soul. It seems daunting, but I'm confident that I see a..." Abruptly, Dorian cut himself off. His eyes widened as an aura gradually formed in the air in front of him. An aura of might, rising from Helena. "What, you can access the laws?" He stared at her in shock. Her face was pale, but there was no sign of pain or stress, as if she wasn't injured at all. My soul has been treated with some type of amazing medicine. The injuries on it are already close to healing. I should be fully healed in just a few days." Helena's voice was full of cheer as she spoke, her body rippling with power. "But, what? It must have been King Heseth." Dorian's eyes widened as he realized what had happened, a sense of gratefulness filling him. When the Shade King treated Helena, he must have gone all out, greatly healing the injuries in her soul. As a powerful and rich ruler of a multi-planet nation, something like a soul reborn pill or soul cleansing pill, or any other high-level pill that could treat injuries to the soul, was likely chump change to him. "I don't have to use the treasures the Moria Liberation Force gained and set aside for me on Moria." He had been fully prepared to spend all of them to gain her either of the pills she could use to heal her injured soul at the Golden Moon auction house. His net worth immediately jumped a huge amount, opening up a large host of options he could spend it on, including treasures to enhance his law comprehension speed and more. "That's great news. With that in mind, we can just direct." Dorian cut himself off as his senses tingled, a feeling of danger appearing. Perfect body, laws. Immediately, energy flooded his body as he spun around, a layer of defensive light covered his hands. SHKK. Not a moment later, a beam of black energy slammed into his waiting palms. The beam immediately dissipated, but not before shocking his hands, setting them numb. Dorian's eyes widened as he felt this. He was in his perfect body mode, with a layer of defensive energy up and his always active mystic armored body live. In terms of physical defense, very few attacks that weren't overwhelming in scale or potency could do too much to him. For such a low-key strike to able to numb his arms, it meant that whoever was attacking was a powerful king-class expert, at the bare minimum. "Show yourself." Dorian's voice boomed out loud, his fists clenched as he stood protectively in front of Helena. "It's no use asking for help, kiddo, I've sealed off any sound from this room. Step away from the Huh, you stopped my attack?" From seemingly nowhere, a lithe and muscular humanoid appeared, dressed in a long, black suit. He was handsome, with bright red hair and beguiling red eyes. The moment Dorian saw him, he felt a very real sense of danger. Species: Vampire. Class: King class, pseudo-angelic. Maximum energy level: 4,312,882. Oh damn, he's pseudo-angelic? Wait, he's a vampire. These thoughts raced through his head in an instant as he blinked, staring at the figure. Whoosh! The red-haired vampire's hands twitched as energy gathered around them. In an instant, a cursing aura slammed into Dorian, trying to knock him unconscious. This powerful aura hit Dorian's soul and then washed right off. My soul is much tougher, even if my energy level is significantly lower. Pseudo-angelic figures can't overwhelm me in terms of raw aura anymore. Dorian realized in a heartbeat. Stop! Dorian twitched as he heard a strong, feminine voice echo out behind him. He kept his guard up as he continued to face the vampire, letting Helena speak. Helena's eyes were filled with strength and determination as she spoke. "Don't hurt him, Uncle Balbinus. He's on our side." Her voice softened as she went on, genuine warmth filling it. This shade is on your side? Our side? Are you all right, girl?" The elite vampire scratched his head in confusion, lowering his hands slightly. The monstrous aura he was giving off lessened in strength. "Uncle Balbinus?" The moment Dorian heard this, his eyes widened. An incredibly strong vampire named Balbinus that Helena called uncle? This had to be family General Balbinus of the Aurelius vampires. "Be that as it may, Helena, I am here to help you escape. High Lord Marcus sent me," the vampire continued, shrugging. "I'm going to have to knock him unconscious to be safe. I won't risk bringing him with us, not when I'm behind enemy lines. This is perfect. This is the opportunity I need. Fate is helping me." Dorian, in the meanwhile, had his mind racing, plans rapidly forming as he took the situation in. General Balbinus was one of the 3 family generals in the Aurelius family and extremely influential. He could act as a liaison and representative of the Aurelius family for almost certain, especially since he was sent here by High Lord Marcus himself, per his own words. "This is it, I can fix this right now." The energy in his soul fluctuated. "All I need to do is convince the family general, with Helena here to help me. King Hasith is already convinced, with him here, we can actually get this all to work." Dorian eyed the family general. As he did so, his soul twitched and he concentrating, feeling the strands of fate seem to warp around him. "I will end this war, here and now." His hand clenched onto the artifact King Hasith had given him. "Actually, General Balbinus, Helena and I would like to have a discussion with you about stopping the war between our races, if you wouldn't mind listening to us." As he spoke, he commanded fate to bow to his will. On a planet dominated by an enormous, gargantuan tree. "Let's go, a journey to the west. It will be fun, it's definitely for the best. Who knows what friends we'll meet along the way. A journey's start shall begin with us this day." An eager voice echoed in the air, the speaker's words echoing out in an odd, rhyming cadence. Will smiled as he looked at the 11th born, laughing out loud. The anomaly had taken on a humanoid appearance, with light red skin and a mostly human body and face. He had thin red lips, a sharp nose, and a set of red-colored pupils that felt faintly draconian. He was wearing a set of black leather hides, with a large battle axe strapped to his back. The axe was mostly just for looks. Number 11 had no idea how to actually use it. "You aren't wrong, Number 11. We've been cooped up so long with Sun Wukong, it's nice to finally be free." Will shook out his long, brown hair, tying it up in a bun. His blue eyes gleamed as he looked at the flying ship that was in front of them. The duo were standing on the edge of a large, brown root, one of the many that grew off the world tree behind them. Will rubbed his chin, feeling the stubble that was growing. His body was lean and muscular, the result of intense training with Sun Wukong, both physical and magical. The monkey was an incredible tutor, able to predict and correct many of his mistakes. The changes were so notable from his previous self, it seemed impossible that only a few weeks had passed. And, for Will, it actually had been more than a year, instead of just a few weeks. Sun Wukong had led them to a secretive and magically enhanced room, a place carved inside the world tree, where time itself operated at a faster rate. Will had gone inside the room multiple times to train, vastly increasing the speed he gained strength and a better understanding of the law of light. And now, in terms of understanding, he had already reached the king class and progressed well into it. The inheritance I gained is the only reason why my progress was so fast. I will never forget the favor you did for me, old man. Will clenched his fists and nodded sharply, his entire body glowing slightly. After we go pay back a debt I owe, we can both go searching for our mutual friend. I'm sure Dorian is doing well. That anomaly, and friend of his, was so incredibly capable, Will couldn't see him being anything other than fantastic. According to Sun Wukong, Dorian was located within the reach of the Shade Commune currently. Agreeable, agreeable. That sounds very much agreeable. We shall travel the worlds, to find a friend to see Abel, cough. At the end of his rhyming reply, the 11th born glanced around furtively, as if recognizing his rhyme didn't quite make it. Will grinned as he saw that, but chose not to comment. He had formed a friendship with the 11th born, and the several other anomalies that were all saved by Sun Wukong. The odd monkey had formed a type of sanctuary here, filled with various anomalies that fought against their nature. Most of them were reclusive, but Will had spoken to and developed friendships with several of them. The 11th born was one of the most social ones. Sun Wukong said he was off to visit an old friend he hadn't seen in a very long time, so we should have at least a few days or weeks. Will continued, one more friend is on his way to the ship, and is set to join our team. Ketsi got a human form. He's healed like a puddle into a stream. Will chose not to question the logic of number 11's phrases, simply shrugging in response. Oh, Ketsi is coming with us? Ketsi, or number 4, or the 4th born, was an enormous serpent beast that was massively powerful. Having him alongside them would be a huge boon and practically guarantee their safety. Number 11 nodded back cheerfully. Well then, we'll wait for him here, but after that, Will smiled. We set sail for the Elector Empire. On a planet far away, in the lands controlled by the draconic tribes. A large, underground cavern existed. This cavern was wide and tall, with a roof that stretched more than 100 meters tall and sides that stood even farther apart. It was gloomily lit by glowing moss and mushrooms, giving the area an eerie appearance. A man with golden hair could be seen sitting at the center of this cavern, meditating quietly. A relaxing aura covered this man, one that glowed faintly with white light. Whoosh! From out of nowhere, a bright portal of blue light ripped a hole in space, just a few dozen meters away from this man. The portal appeared and vanished in an instant, leaving behind the figure of another man. This man had short, graying hair, and a well-maintained black beard that had streaks of gray appearing in it. His violet eyes gleamed, while his strong jaw and small nose gave him a masculine, handsome appearance. A long, red scar ran down the length of his right cheek onto his neck, leading down to a set of muscular shoulders. The man wore a loose, white vest and a pair of white pants. He sighed as he looked around the cave, turning his attention to the man with golden hair. You must be the being that calls himself Zero. The man with short, gray hair spoke aloud, slipping his hands inside his vest as he took a few steps forward. His voice was confident but contained a faintly friendly air. Finally, the golden-haired man reacted. He blinked as he exited his meditation, turning to gaze upon the interloper. That is I. The air quaked despite the soft tone of his voice as he replied, his eyes flashing with bright gold light. A powerful aura began to flood out from the man, simply from his force of presence. And who might you be, wizard? Or are you another failed drake, here to challenge me and die? Zero shrugged as his eyes flicked to the left and right, taking in the rest of the cave and missing nothing. To face me alone, you have earned my respect. Zero slowly stood up, his attention fully focused on the other man. My name is Arthur, the man replied, smiling warmly with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Arthur Tellman. The Wizard King took a few more steps forward, till he was only a few meters away from Zero. He then spoke 2 more lines, each one sounding off in the large chamber, full of calm intent. Hello, old friend, I am here to kill you again. Chapter 212. Evolve. Able to corrupt reality? That sounds a lot like what the law of original sin can do. As he read over the information on the last evolution, he frowned slightly. One-hope angels? He remembered something with his perfect memory, recalling the recording of might, that listed the strongest known beings in existence. Angelic class ranking. 1. Arthur Tellman, the Wizard King of the Boral Autarchy. 2. Grandtherm Flameborn, Dragonfather of the Black Gold Draconic Tribe. 3. Sun Wukong, Almighty Ruler of the Grawl Alliance. 4. Saint One-Hope Gaiden, no affiliation. 5. Hesith Shanti, King of the Shade Commune. 6. Blazenthaw, one of the 3 beast generals of the Grawl Alliance. 7. Cynthia Goudet, head of the Boral Autarchy's Annihilation Department. 8. Homa Whistleberry, head monk of the Free School of Thunder. The 4th-ranked angelic class expert is known as Saint One-Hope Gaiden. He rubbed his chin. Is he related to the One-Hope angel species? He couldn't help but wonder. One-Hope was not a common term or name. This was the only other time he could recall hearing it. The man was listed as a saint, with no affiliation, meaning he was a wandering warrior with such mastery over some type of physical combat. He was considered a peak expert. Technically, just being an angelic class expert already made him a peak expert, but to be ranked 4th meant he was considerably powerful. He put the thought to the side for now as he looked over all the different possible forms he could take, feeling incredibly pleased. Finally, King class forms. By using these, he could vastly increase his strength, even if he didn't officially step into the King class from law comprehension. As he looked them over, he realized that it was a fact that there was no free lunch in this world. Despite having all these powerful forms at his fingertips, he couldn't access any of them currently. To evolve any of them, he needed to find a King class creature's body or soul spell matrix, and use that as a catalyst to evolve his bloodline. This was the first time he'd ever seen anything like that. It was exciting. It meant he was really entering the upper range of all possible bloodlines, where the true elite existed. He put aside the new abilities he'd gained, as well as the new possible bloodline evolutions he might pick up in the future. He already had a few ideas on how to get some of them, but right now wasn't the time to focus on that. Instead, he looked up at the sky and smiled. His body transformed, the magical clothes stored back in his spatial ring as he jumped up into the air. Feathers rapidly covered him as his arms expanded, his face transforming to that of a bird. In just a split second, he returned to his sun eagle form. Whoosh! He began to fly up into the air and then turned off into the distance, towards the direction from which he came. He rapidly began to return towards the city of Crackle. In what felt like no time at all, he made it back, landing out of sight and jogging the rest of the way in. By now, morning had passed into noon, the sun beating down overhead. His arrival back into the city was muted. Instead of going through the front gate, he simply leapt over the wall, moving so quickly he was hard to see. He slunk through the city quietly, not wishing to draw attention to himself. Teams of wizards could be seen working on a few areas of the city, fixing up the damage from the catastrophic battles that had taken place. Reforming streets, walls, shops, and more. Dorian kept out of sight of them as he found his way back to the inn where Helena and the Moria Liberation Force were resting at. The downstairs area of the inn was rather deserted, just a barkeep and a few guests mulling over their drinks. He walked through there to the stairs, up till he found Helena's room. He waited for half a second before he knocked on it. "Come in." He heard a quiet grumble, one that made him smile. He went inside, finding a sleepy-looking Helena resting on her bed. Family General Balbinus was nowhere to be seen, but Dorian was confident he was lurking somewhere around the inn. Helena had recovered a great deal, but not enough to travel yet. According to the general, now that there was a temporary ceasefire in place, they could wait a couple of days to allow her to heal before leaving. The family general seemed to put a lot of trust in the Shade King's word, something that surprised Dorian. Despite being enemies, each side held a great deal of respect for the other. "Hey, how are you holding up today, Smalls?" Dorian smiled slightly, looking at Helena. Helena giggled. "Not too bad, shrimp." She deepened her voice in an impersonation of him, raising her head authoritatively. They crossed gazes for a split second before both of them burst out laughing. Dorian shook his head, smiling at her ruefully as he walked all the way in and sat down on her bed. He gazed at her with eyes full of cheer and delight. Even with her being bedridden, the obvious improvements to her health had left him ecstatic. It wasn't too long ago that she had been constantly unconscious, with an injured soul that prevented her from doing almost anything at all. Time seemed to fly by at a breakneck pace, the hours and days slipping by. Eventually, the news about Moria being cleansed by the mighty Lord Inigo finally came out and caused a huge stir, shocking the entire commune. On a world far from Moria, a large, deep blue lake spread out for miles, teeming with life. Healthy, well-kept oak trees surrounded the lake, planted amongst large swaths of bright green grass. A large river connected to the north of this lake, rustling past peacefully in the mid-morning light. To the west of this lake was a small keep, built out of aged gray stone. Rustic wooden platforms surrounded the edges of this castle but appeared to be in the process of being taken down. The castle had been restored from a previously decrepit state to a pristine, but still ancient, appearance. A gray, paved stone path led to the entrance of the keep. The path moved off in the other direction towards a populated city, many miles from here. Atop the highest point in this castle, a flagpole rose, bearing a large, lightly glowing white flag, white sparks flowing from it. 6 golden circles crossed each other on this flag, forming a unique shape. A small wooden boat floated near the center of the lake, carrying 2 very important shades. High Priest Bashabah sighed as he looked out from the boat, his eyes tired. His tan, leathery skin seemed to have grown older, his once muscular and bulky figure thinning. The stress of the times was starting to get to him, even as a powerful pseudo-angelic class expert ranked among the best in existence. He scratched at his bald head for a moment, his grand and long, bushy white beard blowing in the breeze. He wore a set of simple white robes, adorned with small golden patterns on the edges. A necklace hung around his neck, with an icon of a golden sun hanging at its base. He then turned to look at the other member of the boat. "Is it true, Isaac? Has Moria truly been cleansed?" His words carried in the faint breeze, a hint of power present in them. The other figure on the boat had a younger appearance, his face unlined by age. He had the same tan skin, and was also muscular, but more of a lean kind of muscular. Instead of an adorned white robe, he wore a set of faded gray leather armor, the insignia of a golden sun emblazoned upon it. The same necklace of a golden sun rested around his neck. "Yes, sir." The Holy Prince Isaac of the Church of Light gave a confident response. As Bashabah looked at him, he smiled slightly. He could see a fire in the Holy Prince's eyes that hadn't existed before. An intense desire to improve, to grow stronger, to exceed his limits. The Holy Prince's expedition had failed, in the end. The 20th born had failed to become a true angel of light. But in the end, such a failure was forgivable. The anomalies were extremely difficult to understand or control, odd creatures that were a novelty. This plan had been a test for the Holy Prince, a way for him to gain experience. If he was to truly succeed and become the next High Priest, he would need wisdom and courage, power and strength. He would need to learn how to handle himself in situations that were unfavorable. He would need to fail, and learn how to move on after failing. And, as Bashabah saw the fighting spirit lit inside Isaac, he knew his plan had succeeded. Yes, they suffered some losses, unfortunately losing some Axios team members and failing their mission. But in the end, everything was acceptable as long as Isaac stayed strong. The bigger picture mattered far more than any immediate losses. The esteemed hero Lord Inigo did it himself. His bravery has shaken the entire commune. Isaac's voice was full of admiration for the legendary hero. "Yes, yes," Bashabah replied, glancing over at the Holy Prince. It seemed even Isaac had become enamored with this new hero. "I've heard word of him from Gaiman. It seems he truly does have the best intentions of the commune at heart." The High Priest nodded. It wasn't a bad thing at all having someone of this caliber. New blood was always welcome when it came to the commune. Powerful heroes were always in demand. More importantly, Isaac, how has your training gone? The high priest cut to the chase. High priest, I have reached the peak of king class and am preparing to break into pseudo-angelic. Isaac's eyes gleamed with light as he replied. Good, good. Bathsheba smiled with a smile that did not reach his eyes. The future is rife with danger. Power will be needed if our kind is to survive. The light would not have it any other way. His voice was grand and full of mystery. Isaac's entire body shook, his fighting spirit rising even higher as he heard this. The high priest laughed out loud when he saw this. Keep up your training, holy prince. Don't let this Lord Inigo leave you behind. Of course not, high priest, and I shall continue my training at full speed. Isaac's eyes were full of determination, a smile on his face. Perhaps I can meet this Lord Inigo one day. He sounds like a real shade, a being of honor and loyalty. A true hero. The vision of Lord Inigo in Isaac's head was quite a large one. At the thought of a true hero and meeting someone, a memory flared in his mind, one that made him clench his fists. As for that cretin that killed me several times over back on Magmore, what was his name again? His eyes blazed with fury. Ah yes, he said he was vice-head Taman of the Diamond Department. The air around the Holy Prince shivered with righteous anger. I will obliterate you. A foul villain like yourself has no right to exist in this world. Single quote. Bathsheba looked at the fired-up Holy Prince with fondness. I really should try to pull Lord Inigo over. I'm sure the two would be close allies. He made a mental promise to put some requests in. In the southern area of the Shade Commune, on the world of Pantover, a magnificent castle made of dark blue rock jutted up from a cliff face, majestically constructed with towering buttresses and curled spires. Several roads led to this castle, ones that split off towards huge major cities filled with millions of shades. At the center of this majestic castle, the southern Duke of Shadow, Duke Barmo, stared down at the report he had been given, looking at it in disbelief, and then back up at the shade that had run it to him, informing him of its contents. Did you say, Moria has been cleansed? Duke Barmo was a lean, but strong shade, with a thin jawline but a powerful aura. He wore a set of loose green robes, crossing his arms as he spoke. Yes, sir, Lord Inigo has successfully cleansed Moria, wiping away the traces of the vile demons. The speaker wore a set of black plate armor, one of his loyal guards. The Southern Duke looked away from his subordinate, staring back at the report. He actually did it, the madman. Barmo didn't know whether to laugh or cry as he read about someone doing the impossible, a feat that required incredible power and skill. Someone he just so happened to have personally attacked and attempted to discredit. A sheen of sweat appeared on his forehead as he realized this, his eyes widening. Quick, he spun around, staring at the messenger guard. Send for my long-range messengers. Rush there now, immediately. There is not a moment to waste. When King Hasith Shanti heard that Lord Inigo had successfully managed to cleanse Moria, receiving confirmation that Dorian had actually managed it, he had been in the middle of weapons practice, concentrating as he tossed around several of the knives he kept strapped to his robe. He was in a small, empty practice room, on a small, random lesser planet. The ceasefire meant the war no longer required his constant attention. Instead, he was waiting to hear back from the Aurelius vampires, and from the odd shade he'd recruited to help him save his race. When the Shade King heard of Lord Inigo's exploits, his eyes merely flashed slightly, the aura around him remaining perfectly unchanged. A new look appeared in those eyes now, however, one that hadn't been there before. One of respect and genuine interest, as well as appreciation. And one that was mysterious, wavering back and forth with emotions that even Dorian would have been unable to decipher had he seen it himself. On the lesser world of Tyro, a planet that was 2 planets away from Moria, a large, stone canyon was located near a large world bridge. This canyon was huge, stretching dozens of miles. It was made from some type of ancient, crimson stone, weathered and worn with time. No creatures of any sort lived in this barren area, not a hint of life present. Deep within this canyon, a small cave entrance was tucked away, hidden randomly. This entrance led to a large, circular room, roughly 24 meters wide, empty of any furniture or other niceties. In this room, a heap of bedraggled-looking figures could be seen, leaning against the wall or resting as they argued. That damned 15. I can't believe he and his clone damaged what His Highness left behind. Baron Radishow's voice echoed in the air as he swore, slamming his fist into the wall. Boom. Crack. A network of cracks spread out as the impact from Radishow's punch damaged the wall, causing the entire cave to shiver. Careful, Baron. Most of us are badly injured. Please don't bring the cave down on us. The mistress of lust, Priscilla, returned quietly, all seductive aspects of her voice gone as she breathed in long, ragged breaths. Her hair had turned a pale white and she was currently covered in a layer of energy, focusing on healing from the grievous injuries she had suffered. He is right. Moria is in shambles. It's been cleansed. The work His Greatness left behind ruined. Damal, the master of pride, spoke out loud, his voice full of anger. Of all the members of the demonic council present, Damal was in the best condition. He was heavily injured, but his abnormally powerful physique meant the injuries didn't threaten him as badly as they did the others. It's not all ruined. The inheritances should be intact, as long as Lord Obelisk managed to kill off 15. I have faith that he managed to do that, even if 15 did manage to enact part of his plan. Hallow's voice cut through the arguments, the Master of Envy's words both cutting but wise. With them still left, all hope is not lost. Hallow finished, giving everyone a cool nod. His eyes gleamed with blue light, though he was just as badly injured as everyone else present. The Guardian Knights had taken an enormous toll on everyone, drawing them all to their limits. They had been trapped in incredibly unfavorable circumstances, forced to face up against powerful creatures without even being able to draw upon the power of law. Hallow is right. Kandor, the master of greed, nodded his head as he leaned back against the cave wall, sitting opposite of Hallow. Of everyone present, Kandor's soul was the strongest thanks to his law of greed, allowing him to cut through the pain that plagued his mind with ease. All is not lost. Quote, the other members of the council all remained quiet for a few moments as they continued to rest and meditate. After the destruction of His Highness's castle, and the subsequent cleansing of Moria, the demonic council had beat a quick retreat. Not only had they all been grievously injured, leaving them open to attacks from 15 or their enemies, but everything that had happened here was bound to draw a huge amount of attention. When Moria was still obstructed, it had been fine. Fate magic barely worked on Moria in its original state. There was little to worry about. Now that it had been cleansed, however, they were forced to retreat immediately or risk discovery. And if they had been discovered in their injured state, well, it would have been the end of everything, then and there. Even now, after they had put a great deal of distance between themselves and Moria and had hours and hours to focus on healing, all of them were still in a vulnerable spot. Several minutes passed in silence. Faint hints of auras leaked out from the various members of the demonic council as they continued their meditation. Minutes soon slipped to hours. Like that, roughly 6 hours passed. I've received word from Obelisk. Baron Radishow broke the silence at last, surprising everyone and bringing them out of their meditation. A variety of auras flared up as the members of the demonic council roused and stared at him. What, you've received word from the great demon disciple? What is it? The various members of the council immediately broke out into discussion, voices full of curiosity filling the air. 15 never escaped after all. Lord Obelisk killed him, defeating him. 15 managed to enact his plans to cleanse Moria, but failed, in the end, thanks to Lord Obelisk. The inheritances are all intact. Hallow is right. The Baron's words were full of joy, jumping up and down as he forgot his still healing injuries. In his hand, he held a glowing amulet, the artifact he used to receive Lord Obelisk's messages. When everyone heard this, they immediately broke out into discussion. Oh, well, with his lordship's heaven-killing phoenix form, very little should have been able to stop him. We all saw how he wiped the floor with those guardian knights. Quote, was it a heaven-killing phoenix? It looked more like a brown hellsworn rock to me. Quote, I was thinking an ancient iridescent three-legged crow. Quote, Radishow shook his head as he heard the council members speak, cutting into the conversation to continue. It's even better than that. He began, gesturing with his hands. Lord Obelisk killed Lord Inigo as well, and has stolen his place. He's infiltrating the Church of Light, using Lord Inigo's fame as a cover. What, incredible, Lord Obelisk, wow. Quote, The council members were stunned for a moment before they began to celebrate. After all, having a spy or ally in the higher-ups of the Church of Light would prove a huge boon. None of them doubted that the great demon disciple could achieve this, their faith in Dorian absolute. This is fantastic news. Hallow, in particular, was pleased. He'd always held a personal grudge against the Church of Light. Oh, right, let me inform leader. Our new ally has been looking to make amends with the Great Lord. Radisho began to fiddle with the amulet he used to communicate, mumbling as he sat back down and concentrated. A few minutes passed as everyone continued to talk and discuss, reviewing the developments. Soon, a full-fledged meeting broke out as the council began to plan for the future. Eventually, Hallow took control of the discussion, his voice booming as he changed the topic. Excellent. Now, everyone, remember, we must protect the inheritances at all costs. Every single array is active still, so even King Shandy himself shouldn't be able to shatter them. As long as we don't bring too much attention to ourselves, we will successfully survive. Hallow looked to all of them calmly, getting nods back in return. Good, on to the next topic. He folded his hands together as he leaned against the cave wall. After we recover, we must begin enacting our preparations. Every squadron, every intelligence gatherer, every believer must now turn their focus to one thing. His eyes flashed with light. We must prepare to face off against the destroyer. We can delay no longer, his voice boomed. The return of Lord Obelisk has confirmed my suspicions. Hallow nodded slowly, looking at each member of the council. Ukelli Shorn has returned to the 30,000 worlds. His words slunk through the air, the quivering tension that appeared when the council members heard that man's name palpable. And there is no way we can deal with that man alone. Therefore, Hallow raised an open hand and then slowly closed it in a crushing motion. We must prepare. We will put all of our focus and concentration on this. Every council member must participate. A powerful aura ran flush around Hallow, the air around him crackling with energy. We must begin raising an army. Quote, after arriving back, the next couple of days passed peacefully as Helena recovered. Dorian spent his time meditating and in focus, concentrating on the laws of the universe. He did take a few breaks, however, to do various things, like talk with Helena, catching up with her. They talked about their pasts more, their worries for the future, bonding over all that they had been through. He managed to find the time to talk to the Moria Liberation Force members, thanking them all profusely and celebrating a little with them. In particular, Dorian made his gratefulness known to Captain Fabian, as well as all the other recovering members of the force, sparing nothing to help them all heal up as fast as possible. The warrior alchemist Byron had already left, going on what he said was a journey of self-discovery, to reflect upon his faults and strengths, hoping to solidify his recent breakthrough. He also took the time to send a message over to the Demonic Council, using a special signal array artifact Baron Radisho had casually given him at one point, when the Demonic Council member had become convinced of Lord Obelisk's authenticity. He managed to convince them that he was Lord Inigo now, impersonating 15 so he could infiltrate the Church of Light. By doing so, he tied up any last loose ends, settling a few issues that would have been ticking time bombs otherwise. Dorian had acquired a bit of an awkward spot in the eyes of the Southern Duke and the local leaders of the Golden Moon Mercenary Alliance. Lord Inigo was now a famous hero of the Shade race, so it was impossible for them to do anything to him. Conversely, they had also disrespected him by ignoring him and, in the case of the Southern Duke's men, actually attacking him. As a result, neither had the face to come and greet him when he went out of his meditation. Instead, they both sent apologies by proxy, bestowing a huge amount of treasure upon Dorian in the form of rare artifacts and items. Dorian directly took all of these to the Superior Moon auction house and sold them off, as well as most of the treasure he had left over. Whether it was rare B-ranked energizing elixir pill, expensive A-ranked Whitaker spears, pricey ranked ancient forbidden shields, no matter their status, every treasure he obtained he sold. And in return, Dorian accrued a huge store of treasure geared towards a single thing: speeding up one's comprehension of the laws of the universe. Whether it was the famous high-level gold shields, unique Dharma pills, or Enlightenment Soul Liquid, Dorian gained a large variety of treasures all designed to enhance his comprehension speed and comprehension of the laws of the universe. He also picked up a large number of healing medicines, ones he used to help treat the injured Moria Liberation Force members, especially the ones that had injuries that magic couldn't quickly heal. As a result of his law comprehension enhancement treasures, Dorian began to steadily march forward, focusing on the many various laws he controlled. And right now, in the present moment, Dorian had been in the midst of his meditation when he caught something at the edge of his hearing. He had been using his balanced demon form, the body that was most suited to comprehending the laws of the universe, its unique abilities giving it an edge. Dorian opened his eyes sleepily, waking from his meditative state. He was sitting in his own private room, in the same inn as his allies. Slowly, he transformed back into his shade form, blinking as he stood up. He then walked over to the door to his room, his forehead wrinkled. He opened it up, revealing a familiar figure. Heyo, Goose. Helena was on her feet, her face flush with health and vigor. A rippling aura full of vitality was apparent around her, the debilitating injuries from before almost entirely absent. She wore a long, but tight, black dress that clung to her figure, looking the very image of her past self. Helena. Dorian leapt forward and scooped her up in a huge hug, throwing her around as he laughed out loud, his voice full of excitement. Any thoughts of meditation were tossed to the side as he celebrated, unable to help himself. It's so good to see you. He danced around for a little bit, doing a happy jig as he kept spinning her around, only stopping when she threatened to knock him out. They talked for a few minutes as she walked in, trading jokes and greetings. Helena told him about how she'd felt a ton better, out of the blue this morning, the majority of injuries on her soul finally healing. Dorian, in return, shared the improvements he'd made in his comprehensions. While they were still rather minimal, every little bit helped. As soon as possible, Dorian planned on hunkering down and meditating for a long period, immersing himself in growing stronger. As their conversation slowed down, Dorian looked at Helena. Her gorgeous smile, her welcoming eyes, her petite nose and short, cute hair. He felt his heart flutter as she looked back at him, smiling gently. What is it? She giggled, poking him in the shoulder. Dorian steeled himself, his heart pounding as he took a deep breath. Helena, I have an important question for you. He gave her a cheeky grin, completely hiding his wildly beating heart and nervousness. If nothing else, his powerful soul made such a disguise quite easy. Will you? He began, forcing his courage to the front. Helena looked back at him expectantly. Go on a date with me? He finished with an exhale, unable to control his still wildly beating heart as he looked her in the eyes. Helena gave him a beautiful, warm smile as she grinned and looked at him, her eyes bright. What's a date? Dorian's jaw dropped. Ha 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 ha. Helena's voice tinkled as she saw this, bending over in laughter as she grinned mischievously, clutching at her sides. Just kidding, Dory. She wiped tears of mirth from her eyes as she shook her head at him, a small smile on her face. She then stood up on her tiptoes, right next to Dorian as she leaned in. And kissed him lightly on the cheek. I would love to. Quote, Chapter 213 Return. Dorian's first date with Helena was a glorious success. Where are we going? Dorian had made Helena don a blindfold as he walked her away from the inn, guiding her. Just follow me, Smalls. Dorian grinned shamelessly as he led her away from the inn to a fancy horse-drawn carriage, the type wealthy merchants or nobles used for transportation in city. It was large, with plush cushions and seating on the inside, painted black on the outside. This particular one was drawn by one sky-class white fur horse. He gave a silent nod to the driver he'd hired as he scooped Helena up and jumped inside in one smooth motion. Eep! Helena couldn't resist any longer as she tore the blindfold off and quickly looked around. Hey, that was like 4 seconds. Dorian's protests went ignored as she giggled. Is this a horse and carriage? She stared at him, curious. Dorian held a hand up to her lips, silencing her as he gave her a beady-eyed stare. It's a surprise. Nay, outside, the sounds of a horse neighing as it began walking, drawing them forward, ruined part of the suspense. Not much of a surprise, huh? Helena smirked. Dorian ignored that as he picked the blindfold back up, ignoring her squeals as he blocked off her vision. Then, as she was in the middle of complaining, he delicately grabbed her neck and kissed her. Helena shivered and then practically melted into his arms as they traveled through the city, a romantic evening unfolding. Eventually, they reached the edge of town and left the horse and buggy behind. Dorian led her as the quiet evening fell to a gentle night, walking with purpose while keeping her blindfolded. Soon, they found themselves by a small lake, the chaotic space of the world above them shimmering faintly, quickly blocked by a layer of clouds. Finally, Dorian let her take off the blindfold as he pulled out and set up a blanket and a small collection of delicacies that he prepared back in Cractal. The carpet was checkered with red and white squares, while the delicacies were pastries and snacks from some of the finest restaurants in Cractal. When Helena saw this, she squealed in delight and jumped into Dorian's arms, hugging him. He laughed out loud, hugging her back as he looked into her eyes. The night continued to unfold as they talked about anything and everything. From her recovery to their least favorite colors, from their best combat techniques to their favorite animals. They had a silly, delightful conversation that ended up with Helena resting quietly in Dorian's arms, cuddled up as the night moved onward. The vampires were very similar to many traditional or conservative people back on Earth, putting great importance in marriage, but that didn't stop Helena from kissing Dorian like there was no tomorrow. "Thank you for everything, Dorian," Helena's voice whispered in Dorian's ears as they looked out over the water, the night lazily drifting by. "Of course, Smalls. I got your back, remember?" He gave her a thumbs up as she rested on him, poking her lightly in the cheek. She scrunched up her cheeks as she stuck out a tongue at him, prompting a snort from Dorian. "I mean, like, for helping me when no one else would. For being there, it means a lot." Her voice was small as she finished, a faint blush appearing on her face. Dorian smiled gently. "Good. I worked hard for you, damn it, it should mean a lot." "Ah." Helena's eyes opened wide at the unexpected response. She turned and glared at Dorian, punching him in the chest. "I am trying to have a moment here." "Dorian, ha 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 ha." Dorian guffawed, unable to help himself. After a moment, he leaned forward and kissed her forehead, whispering, "I know, I'm just teasing. I'll always be here for you, Smalls. No matter what." Helena looked up into his eyes, faint tears appearing as she quickly buried herself in Dorian's chest, hugging him tight. Dorian hugged her right back, feeling his heart lift. That single, fateful night was one of the greatest nights of Dorian's life, as far as he was concerned. When they returned back to the city of Cractal, 2 hours later, Helena's face had a faint hint of a flush around it while Dorian sauntered about like he was king of the world. Dorian and Helena unofficially started dating. They kept the news secret for a variety of reasons, not least of which was that Helena was an extremely important figure to the vampires and there was little chance her ostensible father figure, High Lord Marcus, would approve of their relationship at this time. As such, they figured there was no reason to bother the old man. Also, dating an anomaly would put her at risk from the many people that were hunting down anomalies. The next day, Dorian, alongside Helena and family General Balbinus, finally left Cractal. They traveled away without much fanfare, slipping out of the city quietly. Dorian's final goodbyes to the Moria Liberation Force had been heartfelt. He went and visited with every single member, most of them still bedridden as they recovered from injuries. He made sure to give each of them a small, encouraging speech, playing the part of the grateful Lord Inigo, and showing his own, very real gratefulness. "Thank you for everything, Lord Inigo. For showing this old fool that there really can be heroes in this world." Captain Fabian's last comment to Dorian before Dorian left had stuck with him. The martial artist had been resting in his bed in the inn, wrapped up in bandages. The captain had intended the words as a whisper, but ended up shouting them with such volume that it made Dorian wince. "If you're an old fool, what does that make me?" Dorian had been at the doorway, about to leave after talking with the man for a good 15 minutes. He gave the captain a cheeky smile, leaning against the door. Fabian merely shook his head, smiling back. "Till next time, Captain Fabian. Till next time, Lord Inigo." Their parting was full of mutual respect. After jogging out of sight of the city limits, family General Balbinus pulled out a flying ship artifact. He powered the artifact as they all boarded it, setting it to fly high in the sky. It was a small and graceful, black vessel, with a sleek, sharp design that could comfortably fit around 20 people. They then shot off at breakneck speed, soaring by incredibly quickly, far faster than Dorian could fly in his Sun Eagle form. Under the powerful family general's control, they crossed world bridge after world bridge, soaring through planet after planet in a blur. Balbinus's control of the flying vessel was extraordinary and his energy seemingly limitless. While normal flying ships require a large, manned crew, Balbinus was able to shoulder every task himself, forcibly flying the ship at top speed. Balbinus also had the advantage of no longer needing to hide his presence from enemies thanks to the temporary ceasefire they had enacted. It was because of his efforts and this that they made it all the way to Evanon, the exotic world of eternal evening, in roughly 2 days. What happened next moved so quickly it felt like a blur in Dorian's mind. High Lord Marcus was ecstatic to see Helena, welcoming her and Dorian with a grand feast. Dorian ostensibly maintained his cover as Lord Inigo, but was pretty certain the vampire High Lord easily saw through his disguise. The High Lord had been well aware that Helena was friends with an anomaly and seemed to have pieced everything together, though he did nothing about it other than give Dorian a knowing gaze. Marcus awarded Dorian with multiple powerful treasures for his help, sparing no expense. Out of respect for the High Lord, Dorian opted not to sell them. Instead, he absorbed them all for a huge amount of growth energy. According to Asra, when he eventually catalyzed and began forming a king-class bloodline, he would need a huge amount of growth energy. Thus, Dorian opted to begin building that up early, to be prepared as possible for the future. The peace negotiations he had brought along with him set the entire Castle of Darkness aflutter as High Lord Marcus and his family generals and advisors held multiple meetings. The mood of the castle was hard to judge, though there was a certain hint of optimism now that the ongoing war was on pause. Dorian and Helena had set this all into motion, but in the end, didn't play any major role in the talks. The leaders of the Aurelius vampires controlled the meetings and discussions, keeping everything a secret. Dorian did manage to learn that the Aurelius vampires had contacted the Shade King, using the excuse of Lord Inigo and Helena's friendship as cover. Ostensibly, in the eyes of the vampire public, the Shade Lord Inigo had seen beyond the bounds of race and had saved the Aurelius Reaver Helena from being killed by demons, or so the story went. Various rumors about them being married had spread among the vampires, but without any public announcements, everyone was left in the dark. Dorian's antics had left a bit of a mess, but it wasn't anything that would cause too many problems. Besides, if worst comes to worst, I can just marry her. Hey, the thought was ever present in the back of his mind, one that faintly filled him with delight and a hint of guilt. A couple of weeks passed. In that time, Dorian spent time with Helena, relaxing and enjoying her company. He taught her more about how to dance, taking great joy in the close moments they held. They went on walks, went fishing, had picnics, played games together. Their burgeoning relationship finally began to flourish now that the constant threat of annihilation had been put on hold. These few weeks were some of the happiest of his life. In that time, he didn't focus purely on enjoying himself, however. He also put his focus into continuing his understanding of the various laws of the universe, using the huge pool of treasures he'd obtained to enhance his progress. He gifted Helena her own mini, but substantial, supply as well, hoping to help her solidify and grow her own understanding of her law of might. Laws progress. Virtuous laws, 4/7. Demonic laws, 7/7. Law of original sin 6%. Through 2 weeks of effort, Dorian managed to raise his comprehension of the law of original sin from 1% to 6%, laying the basic foundation of the law. This required him to not only raise the progress of all of the demonic laws to at least 6%, but to also integrate them and understand their interconnected pathways. He focused purely on his demonic laws, temporarily ignoring the virtuous laws. Gaining 5% understanding in 2 weeks might seem slow to some. Indeed, considering that laws were much easier to study and gain comprehension in at lower levels, especially for Dorian who had leapfrogged through multiple laws in a short period, the rate was rather slow. However, the law of original sin was an origin law. It was an incredibly complex and abstruse law that literally no one else in existence currently understood. Every step Dorian took was one he forged himself, using his own powerful soul to propel himself forward. If it wasn't for his balanced demon-formed soul of balance helping stabilize himself while he meditated, allowing him to easily control multiple converging laws, Dorian likely wouldn't have even reached 2% understanding yet. Still, even his slow rate of understanding a law was already fantastically fast by the standard of a normal being. It often took years and years for most people to make even a small amount of progress, let alone a couple of weeks. A king class form, it's possible gaining one might increase my comprehension speed. The thought had run through Dorian's mind at one point, one that he felt increasingly certain was true. If he could gain a king class bloodline, he would likely have an easier time integrating his understanding of the laws of the universe. Even if his body remained at a lower level, it was possible his soul spell matrix would increase alongside the power of his body, reaching king class even without law comprehension that reached king class. He wouldn't know for sure until he tested it out, the growth methods of anomalies being quite anomalous. From the list of possible evolutions, there was one in particular that caught Dorian's eye. One that he had realized was achievable if he put some effort in. He didn't have the soul spell matrix or remains of any king-class dragon, nor was obtaining anything like that feasible despite his best efforts. Powerful king-class dragons didn't exactly grow on trees, and finding their intact remains was incredibly difficult. Most things of that nature would be stolen or bought, used up soon after word got out that it existed. As for finding an angelic, divine, heavenly aspected remains, he had literally no idea where to start. He thought he might find it easier to find demonic aspected remains, given that Moria had been a hive of demonic activity, but his lucky soul seemed to have failed him. All of the remains on Moria had dissipated, as far as he could tell. He had absorbed a countless number of powerful demonic remnants, but none of them had been intact king-class beings, and even if they had been, he couldn't access those remains now. That left the final pick: bones, essence, or a remnant soul spell matrix of a king-class undead, vampirian aspected being. Obtaining a king-class vampirian aspected being's remains was unrealistic. The only possible place he might find that would be the internal family graveyard, a place of sacred holiness within the Aurelius family's castle of darkness. There were a few other possibilities, like hunting down one of the few rogue king-class vampires that were unaffiliated and leaned evil, but those vampires were well hidden and even finding them would be extremely difficult. Even if he did break in and manage to desecrate the graves of one of the respected ancestors of the Aurelius family, there was no telling if the remains would hold enough energy to work. Further, he would be offending the Aurelius family beyond repair, souring any and all future relations. The vampires took their pride and honor seriously. There were few worse things he could do than desecrate the graves of their ancestors. That left him with a single option: finding the remains of a king-class undead aspected being. The moment Dorian thought about this requirement, a light bulb had lit up in his head. Undead aspected, but holding a large amount of power? According to Asra, something was undead aspected if they had previously been a living creature but now lived in a state of perpetual undeath. The type of desiccated beings Dorian was familiar with would qualify. A powerful king-class undead being. A memory of what felt like forever ago popped up in his head. A memory of him fleeing from enemies while carrying the dormant soul of Wool with him. A memory of a world of freezing cold, where the dead walked. A memory of a certain Lightsworn fox's betrayal almost ending with his death. Memories of the exotic world of Blizzaria, where an enormous, one-armed king-class giant had fought against a mighty, king-class Greycon. Creatures that were both desiccated. Beings that were undead aspected. The moment he realized this, Dorian's plans solidified. He knew what he had to do. He had to return to Blizzaria. Not only did he plan on picking up the giant bloodline, if possible, he would also pick up the catalyst he needed to evolve his first king-class form, an Empyrean vampire. Everything seemed to fall in place perfectly, his needs and desires met in equal parts. After making up his mind on what he needed to do, Dorian didn't delay. He immediately told his plans to Helena. When she heard what he had decided on doing, at first, she insisted on traveling with him. Eventually, however, Dorian managed to convince her to stay. When he landed on Blizzaria, he fully intended on stealthily hunting down as many of the undead aspected beings as possible, not only absorbing growth energy but also gaining experience and practice using his various laws. Helena had officially become a king-class being and her soul had largely recovered, but Dorian wanted to travel on his own. He needed the practice and also didn't want to put her in any possible danger. Blizzaria was a dangerous exotic world that had killed plenty of king-class experts. Dorian was confident in his capabilities when it came to escaping on his own, but considering that he would likely draw the ire of every powerful creature on the planet, he was unwilling to let Helena risk herself. It took him nearly a day to convince her of the facts, her stubborn refusal cute. Eventually, Helena had settled for intensive practice with family general Balbinus, agreeing that she needed more time to familiarize herself with her king-class capabilities. She hadn't become a genius when it came to hand-to-hand combat simply by luck, but through intensive, constant practice. Like that, the final day of Dorian's stay arrived, and it was here that he had returned to the meeting room with the black and white marble table. It was in this very room that he'd met with the High Lord Marcus after rescuing Helena, receiving the many treasures the vampire had bestowed upon him. It was also in this room that the higher-ups of the Aurelius vampires had held their talks and potential peace negotiations. While Dorian wasn't sure what the end result would be yet, the war was still in a ceasefire, so it seemed the talks were at least not going poorly. "We did it," he repeated the first few words he'd said when he got here, smiling. They'd managed to get truce talks started, successfully giving the Shades and vampires a chance to find peace. After a moment, Dorian turned around and left without a second thought, his eyes full of steely determination. There was no time to waste in the past. He had to keep moving forward. Recently, a feeling of urgency had settled in his heart, one he couldn't exactly explain. It was a feeling that nevertheless surged true to him, a feeling that he knew he needed to follow. It was this feeling that helped spur his movements as he decided to travel to Blizzaria, agonizingly stepping away from the delightful times with Helena to focus on improving his power. Dorian left the chambers, maneuvering through a warmly lit hallway. The Castle of Darkness seemed like a rather cheerful place to Dorian, belying its grim name. The hallways were brightly lit, and with all the vampire activity in the face of ongoing peace talks, it was packed with people. Helena told him it wasn't usually like this, but he wasn't complaining. He traveled down the hallway and through a few others, moving down a set of stairs till he found himself outside one particular room, his own. As he was reaching for the handle, he noted that the door was already cracked open. He blinked when he saw this, pushing the door all the way open. A warm smile appeared on his face as he walked in and saw a petite vampire waiting for him, resting on a couch. His room was a suite, complete with a large couch, a bedroom, and a study, finely decorated with tapestries and paintings. "Heyo, Helena," Dorian waltzed in confidently, his voice sounding off as he waved at the woman. Helena spun around, eyeing him mischievously as she smiled back, her brilliant blonde hair twirling. The vampire had dyed her hair blonde for some reason. She had told him it vaguely had to do with a ceremony she'd participated in after achieving king class and something else to do with the merits she'd brought. Dorian thought it made her look even cuter, her short blonde hair flying snugly around her shoulders. Her brilliant purple eyes gleamed with red light, another transformation that Dorian didn't quite understand. He didn't even know vampires could change their eye color. "Ready to get rid of me already, he continued, walking up right behind the couch. He kissed her lightly on the forehead. "Promise me you'll come back, Dorian." Helena looked at Dorian, her eyes gleaming with emotion as she spoke aloud, sounding the words off slowly. Dorian planned on shutting off all communication while he was on Blizzaria, spending the trip training in true isolation. He would allow no distractions, focused purely on his training. Only by doing so could he truly work on his law comprehension and gaining a new evolution. With Helena tucked up safely in the headquarters of the Aurelius family, he had nothing to worry about. Well, almost nothing. Ever since Will disappeared with Sun Wukong, as he later learned, he had felt nervous about how his close ally was doing. He'd put in several inquiries, taking advantage of the vast intelligence network the Aurelius family held, but come up with nothing. Still, it's not something I can fix now, so I shouldn't worry about it. He decided he would deal with the issue when he was able to, instead of letting it dog and worry him constantly. "We've talked about this, Smalls. I'll be back here in a jiffy. Once I gain the bloodline I'm looking for, I'll start heading back ASAP. Meditating here is likely as good as meditating anywhere else, right?" He rubbed her hair fondly, kissing her again. He was starting to feel like he was addicted to her presence, their newfound relationship blossoming. It felt amazing, and was incredibly hard to tear himself away from. I know, Helena sighed as she leaned forward against him, hugging him tightly. Dorian paused for a moment before hugging her back. "I just worry." Her voice was small. "I've only been with you for such a brief period, yet I already can't stand the thought of losing you." She looked up at him, her gorgeous eyes gleaming. Dorian poked her on the nose. "Stop worrying, silly." "Hey," she yelped back. "Ah ha 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 ha." Dorian ducked under a half-angry punch as he laughed out loud. He then coughed abruptly, his body blurring as he ducked half a dozen more punches, his eyes widening. Ho hold on, it was a Joe Helena. Ah. The rest of his struggles echoed silently on the unhearing walls, punches turning to kisses, and then back to punches at one point, as Dorian and Helena said their farewells. In what felt like an instant, but in reality was more than an hour, Dorian found himself standing in the bat stable of the Castle of Darkness. It was here that the giant bats that the Aurelius vampires used for long-distance transportation could be found. The stable was large, with 24 very large stalls. Each stall opened up onto a cliff face high above a storming ocean. The stable seemed to be carved into the stone itself, well lit like the rest of the castle with warm, magical torches. In several of these stalls, enormous bats could be seen. Large creatures with wingspans at least 5 times Dorian's height, each one was bigger than a trio of horses sitting side by side, with thin wings covered in a black membrane. They weren't particularly strong creatures, only at the Grandmaster class, but each one was sturdy and reliable. Dorian had obtained permission to use one of the Aurelius flying bats to aid his travel, the speedy mount, something that would vastly decrease the amount of time he'd have to waste in transportation. With this, reaching Blizzaria would take a few days of travel, and he could spend that time in meditation or training. Around Dorian, several other vampires moved to and fro, some caring for the various bats while others were preparing to leave themselves. One of the vampire attendants was currently helping Dorian, a young vampire named Salar. Over here, Lord Inigo. Salar waved Dorian down, pointing at one particular stall where a particularly large bat stood, with a leather saddle tacked onto its back. Species: giant black bat. Class: Grandmaster class. Peak: maximum energy level 885. Dorian eyed it for a moment before nodding his head. It was time to go. When I return, Helena, I will have the power I need. He clenched his fist, exhaling harshly as he psyched himself up. He nodded stiffly, his eyes flashing with determination as he stepped forward and did not look back. A couple of days after Dorian left, within the High Lord's favored study in the Castle of Darkness, Marcus Aurelius stood in front of a table with a perturbed expression on his face. He was currently looking down at an intelligence report he had received, his eyes giving away nothing. How accurate is this? His words left his mouth slowly as he turned, glancing to the side. His beautiful red-headed spymaster and rumored lover, Julia, responded immediately. 100%, High Lord. Her voice was grim. Marcus frowned deeply, staring down at what was written on the page. Just when we entered peace negotiations too. He moved aside a few papers, revealing a large map of the 30,000 worlds. He traced a finger over towards the region controlled by the draconic tribes. Not too long ago, the Heavy Wing tribe was reported as fallen. And now, his hand traced over to point at one particular planet. The lesser planet of Hani has been completely destroyed, and the draconic tribes have declared war on the Boral autarky. Marcus's hand slowly fell away, his voice containing a hint of confusion. What in the heavens is going on? Chapter 214 World Phenomena. A loud storm of wind rushed past Dorian's ears, whipping up high into the air as he leaned over the edge of a very tall cliff. He maintained his shade form, but wore a pair of gloves, obfuscating that fact. The only real way to tell a shade apart from a fair-skinned human were the dark points on their hands that gave off particles of shadow that dissipated into the air. With his hands covered, the particles were trapped and vanished out of sight, and it was impossible to tell exactly if he was human or shade. Very few shades would willingly come to Tapra and publicly maintaining that form would draw needless attention. However, he intended to make use of his Lord Inigo identity a bit, and didn't want any type of report to move up the chain, giving away to the public that he could shift forms and was an anomaly. Disguising himself was the best compromise he could come up with. Well, he muttered, squinting. Long time no see, Tapra. Tapra, the legendary archipelago without a sea. The exit from the Aurelius family territory towards the exotic world of Blizzaria. And a world he was very familiar with. Down below him, the tall cliff he was on extended into a gargantuan drop-off that went down for hundreds and hundreds of meters. A layer of fog obscured his vision to some degree, though his enhanced and powerful eyes could pierce through it enough to see the distant floor, more than 1,000 meters down below. He could see a large forest, a collection of jutting mountains, a huge canyon, and more. If he focused, he could pick out thousands of small figures moving on the ground far below, hunting monsters or searching for rare magic herbs and legendary natural treasures, a thriving economy in its own right. That's the Overbull Canyon, right? Dorian reminisced as he looked at one particular canyon and then the jutting pillars of stone beyond it. Memories flowed through his mind, memories of when he combined bloodlines to create his giant mire dragon bloodline, of how he fought and killed a solar rock lizard, memories of practicing combat with Helena. He couldn't help but smile. It hadn't even been that long since then, in real time. Some months at most, but it felt like it had been ages. He'd been through so much since his arrival in this world, it was hard to put everything into words. After leaving from Invading, Dorian's giant black bat had flown almost on autopilot. The vampires had a way of magically setting a destination for the creatures, causing it to fly without Dorian's direction. That left him free to focus on meditating on the laws of the universe. He split his time between meditation, something that would have bored him to death on Earth, and enjoying the sights all around him. The focus on exploring the laws of the universe was an enjoyable, fascinating one that never grew boring. They'd passed over several worlds, including a few interesting ones, like the water planet of Torin, which was, unsurprisingly, dominated almost entirely by water. Traveling so long and high without being on the run from constant danger was refreshing. While they traveled, the giant black bat flew high up in the air, about 2/3 of the way up to the atmospheric barrier that separated a planet from the dangerous chaotic space outside. It was well above most creatures and out of sight of almost everyone on the ground. The bat itself was a Grandmaster-class creature, and a powerful one, its force of presence enough to deter any high-flying creatures from pestering them. It took him a couple days of travel to make it here, crossing over multiple planets. In that time, he solidified his understanding of the law of original sin a bit more, just barely enough to reach 7% understanding. His grasp of the law, in effective power, remained about the same as before. However, Dorian felt that once he reached around 10%, his control in manipulating reality would increase, and that it would increase in increments at every 10% gap, while possibly gaining other powers. The law seemed to require meeting certain thresholds to function. It was an incredibly unique law, such that even Dorian wasn't sure exactly how to best use it. Dorian had found that actively using the law on other beings put a huge burden on him. The stronger the being, the higher the burden, such that Dorian wasn't even able to directly affect masterclass beings with it. He needed to get a stronger understanding of the law before he could directly use it against strong creatures. However, for weaker creatures, Dorian found that the law could be used to affect their physical forms. It was an insidious power that could morph someone else's body, breaking bones and ripping apart muscles. Just by using his strength of will and activating the law, without even touching anything, he could cause a creature to die with a single glance. Dorian shook the stray thoughts from his head as he looked over the edge of the cliff for a moment before turning around. In front of him, a large, burnt crater in the earth stretched out on the ground, all the way up to the city walls of a large, familiar city. Potor City, the same city in which he was captured and thrown into a jail cell, that he had his first long conversations with Helena in, that he stopped from being destroyed by a huge fireball. Dorian stared at it for a moment before sighing with a smile. Dorian's eyes flicked to the right as he heard a beast growling. The giant black bat that had flown him all the way here was staring at him pitifully, lying on the ground a few meters away. Its wings were tucked up into its body as it rested, lying languidly. Its face was twisted in what Dorian was somehow able to determine was a bored expression. He patted the huge bat lightly on the head as he laughed out loud. The creature had been perfectly obedient, but Dorian could sense a stubbornness in its eyes when it flew out of range of Invading. It apparently quite liked its home. "Oh, do you want to go home?" The giant black bat didn't seem to like any of the food Dorian had offered it, instead not eating at all, as if it was hibernating. According to Osra, giant black bats could go for weeks without eating as long as they weren't forced into combat and just flew safely. The huge bat wiggled as if it understood. Dorian laughed again. "Get outta here you. Go home." He spoke the command out loud, holding up his hand and tapping it on the head twice. According to the bat handlers, this was the proper way to instruct it to leave and return back to Invading. The bats were intelligent, able to handle themselves and fly back on their own. Whoosh, Without even giving him a second look, the huge bat abandoned Dorian and took wing, shooting up high into the air. Dorian watched it go with a rueful smile. It faded to a dot in the sky, zooming out across the planet towards the world bridge that they had arrived on, out of sight. He had flown over here to Potor City after they arrived due to his own familiarity with the area. He hadn't come back here just to play around, after all. He nodded his head sharply as he took in his surroundings again. Several large groups of people could be seen moving in or out of the city, across the large plateau that raised this area up from the dangerous grounds of Tapra. Many of them were men and women geared up in leather or plate armor, with bows or blades on their backs. Hunters, intent on taking down prey on the ground floor. Some of them were clearly just magic herb gatherers, dressed in loose clothes or garments, with the occasional blade on their back. He spotted a few wizards, wielding staffs or wands, or various other artifacts. Vampires, ethmen, even a few members of the pyrite race, a variety of beings moved in and out of the city towards the cliffs in flow. Dorian walked away from the edge of the cliff and joined the general crowd of people that were moving into the city. The guards up front had long since streamlined the process, making each person suffer only a relatively short wait. As he walked, his mind flashed back to a conversation he'd had with Mello, and the catalyst for his reason for being here. Back when he was impersonating a shade and traveling to and fro on Moria, Dorian had traveled with Mello for a period. While the duo hadn't talked that much, they still managed to have a few private, casual conversations. Most of the talk had been geared towards the task at hand, focused towards taking out the anomaly 15. They shared most of the information they had about the creature, pooling their strategies. While things had gotten a bit crazy in the end, everything ended up all right. Some of their talks, however, had been about their past. Dorian could remember one particular grumble from Mello that sparked his interest here, Dorian's jade memory, meaning that even the most casual conversation was permanently memorized. Even the most casual tidbit was something he could reflect back on at a moment's notice. They had been in the midst of talking about 15 and somehow the topic ended up on other anomalies. Dorian had explained how he saved some of Mello's anomaly comrades and Mello thanked him. He then brought up another familiar anomaly, the rhyming 11th born. That damned 11th born. I'll tell ya, Inigo, if he hadn't flown over to Tapra's molten core back then, he might have ended up joining me in the end. Mello had had a rare showing of emotion as he complained, but still stuck with calling Dorian, Inigo, out of habit. Oh, what does Tapra's core have to do with anything? Dorian had replied, curious. The laws of the universe are stretched around natural bodies of great power. The 11th born was able to rapidly expand his understanding of the law of fire thanks to that. Mello informed Dorian of something he was only vaguely aware of. He had read, in his time researching and studying the laws of the universe, of something similar, but never thought about it in detail. Their conversation had drifted back on topic after that, returning to discussing 15's tactics. When Dorian was with the vampires, he did some research on his own. He confirmed what Mello had claimed and was actually able to expand upon it. Places like the molten core of Tapra were called world phenomena. The laws of the universe were stretched in these areas. Some laws were enhanced while others were made more distant. World phenomena were usually extremely dangerous, and while they could offer substantial benefits when it came to understanding and studying various laws, few beings would travel there solely for that. Most wouldn't mind taking their time studying the laws of the universe in safety. By the time most people grew strong enough to be able to survive world phenomena, their understanding of a law had likely already crossed into king class, at which point their understanding of that law would have reached completion. Most anomalies started with extremely powerful bodies and often inborn understandings of certain laws, but at a much lower level than any king class being. Thus, most anomalies were uniquely suited to explore these dangerous regions and gain huge benefits. By this point, as Dorian finished reflecting, he had reached the front of the line. The walls of the city stood around 14 meters high. They were quite long, stretching an immense distance to completely encircle the massive city. Potor City was still one of the largest cities Dorian had been to, a huge place housing more than 1 million beings. Several armed guards stood outside a large stone gate, checking people over. One particular guard was clad in a long black robe, sitting back and watching from the ground level as the guards inspected people. He was a wizard, and a vampirian wizard at that, a member of the Aurelius vampires that helped oversee the city. "What's your business here in Podor City?" One of the armored guards waved at Dorian as he stepped up. The man had short brown hair and was human, with a blocky face and a rough-looking nose. "I'm here on official business for the Aurelius vampires." Dorian pulled out a small brooch that flashed with dim red light. The moment the guard saw it, his eyes widened. He turned to look at the wizard behind him, his voice all of a sudden full of respect as he replied. "Ah, of course, my lord. Forgive my impertinence." The human guard backed away as the vampire wizard stepped forward and took over. "I am head wizard Tantor, serving the city guard of Podor in my 3rd year of service. Would you mind if I verify your authority?" The wizard was an elderly vampire, with white hair and a lined face. Dorian scanned him briefly. Species: true vampire. Class: master class. Maximum energy level: 79. By all means. Dorian held out the necklace. It was made of a silver chain with a ruby gem set as the brooch. Marcus Aurelius himself had gifted Dorian this, declaring him an official friend of the Aurelius family. It gave him the authority to travel freely within the Aurelius family territory as well as some degree of authority and privilege. After fiddling with it for a second, the wizard caused a red glow to appear from the brooch. His eyes widened for a moment before he immediately ducked his head, his voice eminently respectful as he replied. "Thank you, your lordship." He handed the brooch back over to Dorian, his hands trembling slightly. He eyed Dorian with a hint of fear, as if he was looking at a powerful higher-up. Dorian watched all of this, feeling slightly bemused. What exactly did he see? What did High Lord Marcus put in it? The High Lord had only told him he wouldn't have any trouble with this in hand, without going into further detail. Just like that, Dorian was waved through, into the city. With his growth energy to stave off exhaustion and rejuvenate his mind, Dorian technically didn't need to sleep unless he wanted to. As a result, he felt no inclination to look for an inn despite it being late afternoon. Instead, he directly moved through the city towards a place from his memories. One of the shops he'd checked when he was here in Tapra, perusing instructions on various types of magic, the Rienda Wizard's shop. There were quite a few shops in the city focused on blood magic, the most popular style of magic for lower-level vampires, but still others that were general purpose. Dorian vaguely remembered seeing part of a highly detailed map in this shop, one that plotted out various special locations all over Tapra. He hadn't had his jade memory at the time, so he couldn't be perfectly sure, but he figured he would check anyway. He hadn't been able to find a detailed map of Tapra's special features within the library he had access to in the Castle of Darkness, and after asking, apparently there hadn't been one on hand either. World phenomena were interesting, but not particularly valuable. The inherent danger combined with the little benefit to powerful figures left most of these unique places abandoned, with few people paying attention to them. Dorian moved through the streets with purpose, blinking as he took in the bustling city. He saw merchants rush past in large carts, hunters and warriors move about confidently with a hint of bloodlust, wizards stride forth talking grandly. He also saw the regular people, bakers, cleaners, scribes, and more, move about quietly, but happily. Podor City was a large, but cheerful city, one that seemed far happier than Dorian remembered. Dorian couldn't help but find it a bit odd. After walking roughly halfway towards the wizardry shop, he couldn't help but pause and listen to a conversation he'd picked up on the edge of his hearing. He stood near the center of a bustling street, his finely tuned ears able to pierce through the cacophony of a busy city and pick out one particular discussion. An apparent midwife was talking to a warrior that was dressed in bear hides, sitting at a table outside of a pub. The midwife was an elderly woman, with long gray hair and a wrinkled, friendly face, while the warrior appeared to be in his late 30s, but muscular and buff as any other human warrior might be. He had short black hair and a half-handsome, but somewhat forgettable, face. He could tell she was a midwife because she referred to herself in third person as a midwife, a rather odd habit, but Dorian wasn't going to judge. "Son, your expedition took you far too long. It's good you came back, you almost lost this old midwife." The elderly woman's voice wavered as she batted her son on the head. "Ma, I told you I would be away for half a year. How could I have known the city would have been attacked?" The son's voice was youthfully belligerent and wronged, not matching his age at all. "It was a plot from those damned shades, I tell ya." The old city lord got killed and his wife went missing. And then a huge meteor almost slammed into the city, but the Aureliaguan vampires. Aurelius vampires, Don't interrupt your mother, son. As I was saying, the heroic Aurelius vampires stopped it all and saved us. Thank the heavens for that. Our city is truly a blessed one now. She shook her head sternly. The warrior looked at his mother with a helpless expression. He shrugged, picking up a pint of beer that was on the table before him and taking a swig from it. Dorian smiled slightly as he heard all of this. Somehow, without even noticing, his actions seemed to have become a bit of a legend, though the Aurelius vampires seemed to have taken most of the credit. Well, Ma, be that as it is, I need to go report to the 6th Palace Inn. Oh, the 6th Palace, son? The man's mother interrupted him again, shaking her head. Son, the 6th Palace is still in repairs, and has been ever since the attack. Someone destroyed the roof and the 6th Palace Master has had the repairs all done manually. He's currently living in one of the Exalt mansions at the north of town. She patted her son reassuringly on the shoulder. When Dorian heard this, he couldn't help but smirk. Helena had told him about how she had accidentally destroyed the 6th Palace roof. He had the repairs done manually? What? Why? The warrior stared at his mother in disbelief. Oh, well, apparently the spell field of the Palace Masters catastrophically failed, spreading a huge amount of panic. Most of the Palace Masters decided on relocating after everything came to a rest, and the original palaces are slowly being sold off. Dorian looked away guiltily at that. He had absorbed that spell field long ago, though only out of necessity. Perhaps he should anonymously donate to have it repaired. They say it was that dreadful titan that destroyed the spell field of the 12 palaces and the roof of the 6th palace, after murdering one of the palace masters. What a monster! The elderly woman shuddered, shaking a fist in the air. Dorian squinted, instantly losing any desire to help repair the spell field, while also feeling mildly wronged. He hadn't had anything to do with the collapse of the 6th palace's roof, and the palace master he had killed had had it coming. As a midwife, I can tell you right now, all that energy being blown apart is bad for the children. Nobles these days let their babes rest way too close to unreliable magic. She sighed as she shook her head. It was at that moment, as Dorian was immersed in eavesdropping, that he was rudely jarred from his focus. Out of the way, out of the way. Carriage. A loud voice caught Dorian's attention as he snapped his head forward, staring. A large and sleek, black carriage was bustling down the road at high speed. Dozens of people moved out of the way quickly, wagons and warriors alike avoiding the carriage. A few of them turned to swear but paused when they saw the sigil emblazoned on the carriage, turning away in defeat. Dorian squinted at the carriage, his eyes scanning it. Inside, he could feel the presence of a Grand Master class being, as well as 2 Master class beings. An important-looking sigil was emblazoned on the side of it, likely that of one of the palace masters of the city. In just a few scant seconds, the carriage had moved halfway towards Dorian, with no intentions of slowing or stopping. Out of the way. The driver was a young, sky-class human, dressed in a fine suit and looking every bit the important steward. Dorian blinked slowly as the carriage rushed towards him, and then casually walked out of its way. The driver was a bit rude, but there was no need to waste time causing a scene, right? It wasn't like he had to be arrogant and demanding now that he'd gained a bit of strength. His personality wasn't just going to jarringly shift, not like it did when he'd had Ukelli's memories. As the carriage shot past him, however, a small smile appeared on his face. Baby Hyperion beam. He called into existence a minuscule Hyperion beam and fired it off immediately, creating a nearly invisible line of power that shot through the air and landed on one of the back wheels. Boom! The back wheel of the carriage exploded, causing the carriage to crash and skid to a stop, bits of wood falling off as it tumbled forward. None of the common people were injured due to most of them having already moved out of the way, but the inhabitants of the carriage were sent flying out of it, tumbling unceremoniously on the road. Who dares? The half-vampire daughter of the 3rd Palace Master came up sputtering, her long blonde hair full of wooden chips as she picked herself up off the ground. She had been wearing a nice green dress, one that was now covered in dirt and grime from the street. By the time she managed to look around, however, a certain, mischievous anomaly had already vanished, jogging away with a cheerful smile on his face. A short amount of time later, Dorian was back outside the city, opting to move quickly instead of stay and visit. In his hands, he was currently folding up a detailed map of Tapra, his memory proving true in the end. The shop he'd traveled to not only held a detailed map, but the wizard overseeing it was able to give him a clear explanation of several points. He smiled as he stretched his arms and legs, looking over the edge of the cliff and then around him. It was already evening, with darkness making its inevitable march onward to conquer the last dying embers of daylight. The surrounding area was far less busy, with very few men and women about doing business. Almost everyone he saw was making their way back toward Podor City, with very few headed out to the cliff edge. After double and triple checking that no one was watching, Dorian stuck his toes off that edge. He then leaned over it. "Let's go see what this molten core has to offer before we skip off to Blizzaria." He casually jumped forward, tumbling down away from the edge of the cliff. As he fell, his body rapidly transformed, his sun eagle form bursting into existence. A light trail of flames fell from his wings as he thrust forward, blazing off into the distance, headed towards the most dangerous region on the planet. Chapter 215 The Core. Dorian soared through the air, flapping his wings agilely. It took him only a few moments to blast more than a mile away from Podor City, his sun eagle form's speed faster than many flying ships. To the very few people that were scaling the cliff, he appeared as a brief blur of fading, fiery light that vanished into the distance. As he flew, Dorian drew upon the laws of the universe. In particular, he focused on the law of pride and the law of valor, both laws that boosted the power of one's physique. In terms of comprehension, every individual law had 3 interim stages and 1 final stage. The early stage, the middle stage, the late stage, and the completion stage. Dorian's law of pride had reached the middle stage, as had his law of valor. He had already progressed a large amount on his law of valor, one of the earlier laws he'd obtained, and his law of pride was something he focused on significantly over the past several weeks, raising it, alongside many of his other demonic laws, at a high speed. Comprehension was comprehension. Once you reached completion, your comprehension of a law would be equal to any other king-class expert, with no exceptions. Each stage reached was a milestone, and the speed that you reached each stage it didn't matter much. There was no need to steady your understanding or foundation after reaching a new stage. Everything you learned built up upon itself. It was entirely possible to rush to completion, as long as your soul could bear the increase and you knew intimately how the law worked. This was why inheritances were viewed with such importance, due to the great powers they could quickly convey. On the other hand, after you reached completion, the state of your soul and your understanding of it would solidify. You could only grow the limit of your soul before you reached completion of whatever law you were studying, per what Dorian had researched. You could still greatly increase in power, but the maximum strength you could reach was determined by how powerful your soul was at the time you reached king class. Rushing to complete a law wasn't always the best idea. As for people that used multiple laws, Dorian had no idea how that worked. The number of people like that was extremely minuscule. There was no record or historical writing that he had seen, or word from anyone he'd spoken to, on what would happen to him after he reached completion in any of his laws. With his enhanced physique, Dorian's body rapidly began to grow stronger. The air around him shivered slightly as a powerful aura of energy appeared. His flesh grew sturdier and his bones stronger, enhanced by the thronging energy. These two energies gradually built upon each other. Soon his body was soaring through the air at a blur. Finally, when he felt his 2 laws reach their maximum usage with his current understanding, he activated his perfect body ability. Boom! He broke the sound barrier. With his law of valor and law of pride enhancing him with energy, and his perfect body ability perfecting his physique, his strength increased at an exponential level. This form alone was equal to an early king-class expert, even without having reached completion of any law. His sun eagle form smashed through the air like a missile, the faint trail of flames he left cindering and dissipating behind him into the night. He soared through the sky with impunity, flying over a vast, desolate wilderness. His demonic eyes allowed him to see even in the dark, letting him spy on the world below. There were scattered plateaus that held small islands of land set haphazardly about, but the majority of land on Tapra was centered in the deep and dangerous ocean of nothingness that existed, far below. As he flew over Tapra, he made out huge chains of mountains, jagged forests with tough, gripping trees, large lakes set deep into the ground to avoid being blown away, and more. Tapra had dangerous wind storms that swept through its oceans of nothingness on occasion, making it unfeasible to inhabit the lower areas long-term. He could make out a variety of creatures, with the majority of ones he could detect being at the sky class or stronger. It was hard for weaker creatures to survive out here in the wild. Let's see, first I go this way, all right. In his head, he followed a mental trail plotted based on the map of Tapra he'd found. He flew for more than an hour as he shot along in the air, hurtling forward at breakneck speed. He tapped into the law of sloth, enhancing his recovery speed as he flew. This allowed him to not only heal at a faster rate, but also gather energy and replenish his soul. As long as his energy expenditure with the laws of valor and pride, and the perfect body ability, was not too significant, his law of sloth could make up most of, or all, of the difference. Functionally, that meant he could fly for as long as he wanted. Eventually he'd have to eat, or drain his growth points to stave off physical exhaustion, but that wasn't something he needed to worry about presently. Another hour passed as he flew, following a trail of landmarks. He encountered a few flocks of creatures, most of them master class, with a few grandmaster class beings. One and all immediately turned tail when they saw him, the powerful, rippling aura he gave off scaring them away. Finally, after one more hour of extended flight, he found his destination. He'd lost track of the miles as he flew, crossing such a long distance over such an extended period it felt vaguely surreal. He didn't actually lose track, thanks to his jade memory, but his immediate memory of the travel was somewhat vague unless he focused. He hovered several hundreds of meters in the air as he looked down at his destination. A gargantuan, gray crater in the ground, carved into the rough stone by some terrible force many years ago. The crater was completely smooth, without any cracks or crevices in the edges or sides. No creatures were visible and there were no plateaus of any sort in the area. This entire one was abandoned, ignored by most. At the center of this crater a large, gaping hole could be seen. Warm, orange light shot out from this hole, simmering up into the air. When Dorian flew within a few thousand meters, he could feel a veritable wave of heat wash over him. Even his sun eagle form, which was a creature very used to heat and fire, felt vaguely uncomfortable. He had found the molten core of Tapra. That said, while the molten core was indeed out of the way, it wasn't as if it was particularly hidden. The wave of heat and light it gave off was noticeable as soon as one entered the area, and visible even from a distance. Dorian dived down towards the ground after making sure that everything was safe. The wind rushed past his feathers as he cut through the air, forming a small gust. The closer he got to the crater floor, the more and more heat swarmed over his body. Even in his sun eagle form, he could feel himself start to grow singed simply from growing near to the crater. As a result, in midair, Dorian shifted over to his balanced demon form. Thud, his body slammed into the earth, surprisingly not making even the slightest mark. The ground beneath him was incredibly tough, his claws leaving only the faintest scratches as he landed. His eyes flicked to the left and right, double-checking everything from the ground level. As he had expected, no one guarded it nor was there anyone nearby that he could sense. This particular world phenomena was rather unpopular. And, as he landed, he fully experienced the reason for its lack of popularity. Heat, sweltering, crushing, hellish heat. His balanced demon's body of balance ability was passively active, helping throw off the heat and keep his body in a stable position. He tapped into the law of sloth, but released his other laws as he blinked, gradually keeping himself in a state of homeostasis. The ungodly heat crashed against him and was no longer able to affect him. Any energy he lost recovered quickly after. He stretched as he felt this. He then turned his focus towards the gaping hole that was emitting heat and light. He began to walk towards it. According to the map he'd looked over, the molten core of Tapra was located in the hole at the center of this crater, several miles down. The core was exposed, and as a result, constantly emitting heat and energy. This source of power disturbed the atmosphere and caused weather like the violent windstorms that swept Tapra, rippling in the air. The closer Dorian got, the more energy was drained from his balanced demon form. Still, it was all within acceptable bounds thanks to his law of sloth dealing with the brunt of the drain. In no time at all, he reached the edge of the hole. It was about 6 meters wide and long, a sizable cavern more than just a hole. The ground around it was perfectly smooth, an unusual sight for such a large cave entrance. He peeked over the edge and then immediately winced. The moment he looked down, a huge wave of heat slammed into him, far more intense than anything before. Dorian could feel the blood in his balanced demon's form expand and vibrate, the agonizingly brutal temperature far exceeding its normal conditions. Energy began to fly off him in a torrent as his body of balance ability made up for the difference, fighting back against the heat. As Dorian felt this, he took several steps back, frowning. If it was like that, he wouldn't stand a chance at getting anywhere near the molten core. According to the map, the core itself was still quite a bit down below this crater, tucked deep into the tunnel that connected here. The unique stretching of the laws could only be felt if one reached an area closer to the core. Did the 11th born really fly through all of this? Dorian raised his mental opinion of the rhyming dragon in his head. As he thought of the old anomaly, inspiration struck him. He abruptly smiled as he stepped forward, leaning over the edge and crashing into the pillar of heat once more. This time, Dorian shifted right into his Ifrit form. Immediately, the overwhelming sensation of heat vanished as if it had never existed, replaced with only a moderate sensation of pressure, something that he could easily ignore. Ah, that's better. As soon as he returned to this form, he let out a relaxed smile. While in terms of raw strength the Ifrit bloodline was not a particularly powerful bloodline, the bloodline did have the rather unique ability to both manipulate and be virtually immune to fire. It just went to show that power wasn't everything. He felt almost completely unaffected by the molten core in his Ifrit form, at least, from the surface. He was aware of the heat, but keenly could tell that it couldn't hurt him. It was ever present, but unable to do much of anything. With that in mind, he leaned fully over and looked down the hole. His eyes were able to pierce past the glittering light down below to get a vaguely clear picture. The tunnel continued down into the earth for about a mile. This crater, and the ground area around it, was already extremely deep into the planet of Tapra itself. At the end of that mile-long tunnel, Dorian could make out a huge ball of white fire. He couldn't make out everything clearly, but the massive blazing fire was clearly visible. It was from this storm of flames that he could feel the boiling heat and beams of light shoot out into the air, up and all around him. Interesting, he thought, after a moment of studying it. He climbed into the tunnel, sticking to the sides as he began to scale down it. His spatial ring could easily bear the brunt of the heat, designed to last in extremely dangerous situations. Small, extremely tough spatial rings like his were not at all uncommon. They were created with space magic and imbued in such a manner to make them very resistant. As Dorian began to scale down the sides of the tunnel, the feeling of pressure slowly increased. Even if his Ifrit form could ignore the heat, he couldn't ignore the sheer amount of energy that was being emitted by the blazing fire down below. However, with his powerful physique and soul, he could bear it, if not ignore it outright. The walls of the tunnel were mostly smooth, but in here, Dorian could find a slew of large and small cracks, as if they had been immortalized in the stone. He was able to use these to help himself have a controlled fall, taking several dozen meter-long drops. As he scampered down, the waves of pressure continued to grow in intensity. Several times, his Ifrit body was banged forward or backwards, knocking him into the walls as he descended. Dorian stuck past all of that, grunting as he ignored it and continued on his way. In a short period of time, he found himself at the edge of the huge sea of boiling white flames that he had found. At this point, the huge pressure on his body had reached a peak, making moving forward difficult. Despite that, the overwhelming temperature still didn't affect him in the slightest. Now that he was up close, Dorian could see that an entire, massive chamber existed in the room with the flames. This chamber seemed to stretch for miles downward, back towards the center of Tapra. The noise from the chamber was deafening, constant explosions and impacts crashing all about. From this chamber, he could sense something strange. It felt as if the world around him was being pulled in towards this chamber. It was a surreal and uncomfortable, stretching sensation, one that he couldn't seem to shake. Interesting, he repeated his earlier thought. After a moment, Dorian found himself a good perch just outside the entrance. The cave hole had several small outcroppings back from, but near, the edge that led into the main chamber. He sat down at one of these and shut his eyes, spreading his senses out to the world around him. What he found delighted him. My laws of lust, envy, pride, and greed. I can sense them all more strongly here. He muttered out loud, his eyes closed. The words actually vibrated out of existence before coming to any fruition, the ungodly heat present preventing him from actually speaking. The violent energy before him didn't do much for virtuous laws, maintaining a fairly neutral stance for all of the ones he currently held. His balanced demon form was his best form for sensing the laws of the universe. However, with his now advanced understanding of most of the laws, he could more finely grasp them when he focused. Even in his Ifrit form, he could now sense the laws even clearer than when he was in his balanced demon form, by a noticeable degree. The power of a world phenomena was just that significant. It was mysterious and magical, a place in the universe where reality itself functioned differently. A truly miraculous spot. The only really difficult to grasp law was the law of original sin, but that was a law that he could only understand through gaining progress with all of the demonic laws and then slowly merging that progress. But my connection with the laws of wrath, gluttony, and sloth actually feel as if they have decreased. He frowned for a moment before shaking his head and smiling, noting the detraction. While this world phenomena clearly brought some laws closer, it also pushed others farther away. After a moment's thought, he shook the negative from his mind. Boosting his comprehension of 4 of his demonic laws was already worth it in his book. Anything that could save him time and allow him to grow his strength at a faster rate was a huge win. Dorian blinked as he exited his meditation, stepping over to look into the chamber that housed the molten core. The molten core of Tapra was special because of its extreme heat and unique position as the center and supporting core of a planet. It was part of why Tapra was such an interesting exotic world, unlike regular planets. Perhaps a place of extreme cold would help the other laws? While the idea was simplistic, Dorian felt there was a certain logic to it. I'll check around Blizzaria while I'm there for something like that. He grinned. But first, I'm in no hurry to leave here. He nodded his head, stepped back away from the edge as he sat back down. Of the laws of lust, envy, pride, and greed, only pride has reached the middle stage. The idea of staying here to meditate had jumped into his mind. While he was in a hurry to gain a king-class form, he also wanted to increase his strength before he did anything too dangerous. Making a small pit stop here on Tapra before he left for Blizzaria sounded like an excellent idea in his book. The laws of lust, envy, and greed were all in the early stage of comprehension at the moment, but decently close to the middle stage. Breaking through to that stage would boost his maximum energy level, marking a tangible increase in power. With how close he felt to the laws of the universe here, specifically for those laws, Dorian figured it would only take a couple of days at most, as long as he used up some of the treasures he'd brought with him. All of the meditation he'd done over the past 2 weeks had helped build him up to this, preparing his foundational understanding. Without hesitation, Dorian settled in for a period of meditation, to break through each of those laws to the middle stage. He would take full advantage of the world phenomena, not letting it go to waste. Without anything like this, he had originally planned on it taking him between 1 and 2 weeks to break through. The higher his law comprehension reached, the slower it seemed to keep increasing. With this world phenomena working in his favor, however, he closed his eyes shut as he focused on the world around him. The next time he opened his eyes, he would leave for the world where the dead walked. On a world far from Dorian, a certain monkey sat atop a small tree branch, staring down at a trio of visitors. Sun Wukong looked tired. His large prayer beads hung limply around his neck. His body seemed to lean back slightly against the huge tree he was sitting next to. Even his aura felt somewhat faded. He held his staff loosely in his hands as he relaxed, lazing about comfortably. It was mid-afternoon on the planet that hosted the world tree, the sun overhead shining its warm sunshine, barely able to pierce through the thick foliage that housed the upper branches and leaves of the world tree, far above. The 3 visitors and Sun Wukong were all standing on or near one of the large roots that rested upon the surface of the planet. When Sun Wukong looked at the beings in front of him, he couldn't help but smile. You must be Zaphon and you must be Aaron. I've heard a bit about you too, from a pair of merry vampires that passed by not too long ago. His voice was full of warmth as he nodded at 2 of the figures, giving them a smile. Zaphon's vaguely demonic-looking figure, with a large, glowing green gem set in his forehead, lit up as he saw that he was recognized. The anomaly looked as cheerful as ever, fully recovered from the trauma he'd suffered on Magmoor. Behind him, Aaron's heavily armored form stood stalwartly, his wolf head mask covering his head up completely. Beneath his armor, a powerful, deadly anomaly lay bristling, watching everything around himself carefully. The third and last figure was a being Dorian would have recognized in a heartbeat. It was a very plain and unassuming form with gray skin. A form that possessed a unique ability to phase through reality. A form that Dorian had just obtained the bloodline for quite recently. That of a gray manter. Oh ho? Well, I was unaware my cooking talent had spread so far, but Zaffin began but was cut off almost immediately as the third figure interjected. Zaffin. The gray manter's voice echoed out coolly, full of authority as he motioned for silence. Zaffin glanced at the being, his mouth twitching slightly before he bowed his head. Ah yes, you. Sun Wukong looked at the speaker, his eyes twinkling. We finally meet. Sun Wukong stood up, his body blurred as he moved incredibly quickly, so fast that he couldn't be visibly tracked with the naked eye of anyone present. This got surprised glances from both Aaron and Zaffin, but merely a blink from the gray manter. Sun Wukong held out a hand as he reappeared right in front of the third figure. I've heard a lot about you as well, Mello. Chapter 216 Annihilate. Back on the planet of Evanen, Helena looked out at the turning sea with a sigh. The ever-present evening light cast a dark shadow behind her as she waited quietly, staring at the sloshing waves. She had heard from Marcus of how war had broken out between the Boral autarchy and the Draconic tribes. These two major powers going to war was a huge incident. It was something that was bound to shake the entire 30,000 worlds, if both forces were serious about this. The effects of such a war were bound to reach them, even all the way over here. Yet here, all she could think about was a certain anomaly that was no longer present. Come home soon, Dorian, she whispered quietly to herself, her eyes gleaming. Helena had never been a social person, much preferring a life to herself. Yet with Dorian, everything felt comfortable, everything felt safe. He reminded her a lot of High Lord Marcus in that way. She smiled ruefully as she stood up, glancing around. She was standing on one of the stone towers that connected to the Castle of Darkness. No one else was present. Thud, someone landed on the roof right next to her. Helena remained perfectly calm as she swiveled, her hands at the ready. She leaned down in a fighting stance, every cell she had alert. She perfectly entered her martial focus, an aura of might ready to burst out around her at a moment's notice. Lady Helena. The figure that landed on the roof immediately went to one knee, bowing. Helena started when she saw this. Not because of the bowing, but because of the man's appearance. He wasn't a vampire, but instead was a human, dressed in black leather pants and a black shirt. He had smooth, brown eyes, with a small gray beard and with a short head of gray hair. On his back, a beautiful, ancient-looking bow was slung, colored a blood-red hue. Yes, Helena began, her voice carrying a hint of confusion. My name is Leader. I've come in search of the Great Lord. Leader's words carried a hint of fanaticism as he glanced up, looking into Helena's eyes. The Great Lord? You mean, Dorian? Helena stuttered. When Leader heard that, his eyes lit up, a warm smile appearing. His entire demeanor seemed to relax as he looked at her, genuine happiness appearing. It is as I suspected, please forgive my abrupt appearance. The Great Lord indeed fooled the Council all along. What they thought was an enemy was merely a clever test, to help find the traitors like 15. He nodded to himself, as if everything now made sense. There were a swirl of rumors about Lord Inigo's mysterious wife in the Shade Empire. It wasn't publicly known that Helena had been the one accompanying him as his wife, nor was it even well known that his wife was a vampire. The accusations thrown out by the Southern Duke's subordinate had been silenced and any stray rumors quashed by the authority of the Shade King. The leader of the Shade Commune was currently in talks with the Aurelius vampires, under a strict ceasefire, and would allow no distractions to interfere. Leader, however, had picked up on everything. When he pieced it all together, putting all the clues up, he gradually reached a different conclusion than the one that Council reached. Everything only made sense to Leader if the Great Lord, Dorian, was the man known as Lord Inigo all along. And for that to be possible, it meant that Dorian must have killed the original clone or subordinate that 15 had sent out as Lord Inigo, taking his place. He then used that as cover to test the demonic council. A bunch of blind idiots, there's a reason I never joined them. As leader was in the midst of congratulating himself and his own genius, Helena began to realize who she was talking to. She remembered hearing about a powerful archer that used to follow Dorian around faithfully, an archer that had been separated from him after the disaster at Magmoor. An archer that used the demonic law of pride, but was not evil, one that believed Dorian's presence was a sign that the demonic laws would return to operate openly. And, indeed, given that Dorian had gained all 7 of the demonic laws, he wasn't really wrong in that regard. He was an archer of supreme skill with the same name as the man before her. Leader, Lord Inni, the great lord is no longer here. He is off on a journey to increase his strength and understanding of the laws of the universe. She responded quickly, wondering how Leader had managed to sneak up to her. This was the Castle of Darkness, after all. To achieve this much, his strength must have increased greatly since the last time he talked to Dorian. Leader seemed to sense Helena's intent, figuring out that Dorian didn't need or want company right now. Then I will stay behind here with you, my lady. Leader's eyes flashed as he nodded, making up his mind. The 30,000 worlds are no longer safe. Helena stared at him oddly. I am in the Castle of Darkness, Leader, one of the safest places in the world, home to a pseudo-angelic expert and the strongest stronghold of the Aurelius family. She continued, I am quite safe, and she clenched her fists. Whoosh! A raw, but tightly constrained aura of might burst out from her. This electrifyingly strong aura forced Leader back a couple of steps, widening his eyes. I need no protection, as expected from the Great Lord's woman. Leader nodded knowingly to himself. When Helena heard that, and realized what it meant, she blushed faintly and donned an annoyed expression. I meant you no disrespect, great lady. He seemed to take it for granted that she was with Dorian now. But, a storm is brewing, Lady Helena. Leader's eyes narrowed, his demeanor shifting to one that was extremely serious. He has returned. He? Helena stared at him, not understanding. The council confirmed it. It's why I took so long to get here. Leader rubbed at his eyes. The Great Destroyer now walks the 30,000 worlds. 2.5 weeks prior. Hello, old friend. I am here to kill you again. After the words left Arthur Tellman's lips, the Wizard King clasped his hands together. As Zero watched all of this, his golden hair slowly started to flutter. An angelic halo appeared and flickered around his head, flashing a myriad of colors in its incomplete form. You may find that quite a bit harder than you anticipate, Wizard. Zero remained sitting, but the air around him seemed to shiver as he stared at Arthur. The large underground cavern the duo stood in seemed to quiver, the air quaking as energy surrounded the Wizard King. A golden, angelic halo appeared around Arthur's head, shining with light and power. Arthur's eyes gleamed with yellow light as he stared back at Zero. I may find this hard? Arthur's voice was soft as he spoke, filled with a hint of amusement. I have trained every day for 1,000 years for this moment. In fact, the Wizard King casually waved his hand to the side. Creation magic. Universal space prison reveal. Whoosh! Immediately, a huge tear in space appeared, 30 meters wide and long. A burst of wind whiplashed throughout the large cavern as reality tore, cascading about chaotically. Inside this tear, a world of white fog appeared. This fog flashed with ethereal light, glimmering mysteriously, and seemed to go on endlessly. After a few seconds, large tracts of the fog began to fade away, revealing something rather strange. Dozens of figures floated in this fogscape, spaced several meters from each other. Some figures had demonic features, while others looked angelic. Some were huge and towering beasts while others were small and diminutive. I have already done this many times before. You will be the 47th anomaly I have captured. Arthur took a step forward. Zero's eyes remained unperturbed. I am not like them. I am the strongest. Nothing can defeat me. Black energy crackled around Zero, a powerful aura rising. However, for a split second, his attention wavered as he looked at all the other anomalies that were sealed within the tear in space. The Wizard King took advantage of that split second, dismissing the portal and activating 2 spells. Creation magic. The words blasted from his mouth like a meteor, cascading in the air. Form. A meter in front of the Wizard King, a small particle of light appeared. This particle was extremely tiny, so small it was invisible to the naked eye. Despite its small size, however, this particle contained an incredible amount of energy. Right after this particle came into existence, the Wizard King uttered one other spell. His body moved unnaturally quickly throughout all of this, his physical speed enhanced thanks to a small ring that glowed on his finger. It was such that he completed both spells within that split second, the words shooting out of him. Creation magic, he whispered, detonate. As this particle finished forming, in a fraction of a second after the Wizard King activated his second spell, it began to twist. And then, near instantaneously, it broke. This tiny particle suddenly became two tiny particles. Then, it broke again. And again. And again. Every time it broke, a small bit of the huge store of energy present in it would flash out. This caused a chain reaction as the pieces of it that formed broke over and over, repeatedly. All of this happened in less than a millionth of a second, so incredibly quickly that no one present could react. The small particle broke 27,812 times. The resulting energy was hyper-concentrated, but after the numerous chain reactions, it rapidly began to expand. A flash of white light shot out. The Wizard King's body flickered and vanished. A moment later, a gargantuan explosion obliterated the underground cavern. Boom! Whoosh! Raw energy expanded outward at a speed exceeding the sound barrier. This powerful force not only destroyed the underground chamber, but it also blasted into and incinerated the surrounding earth and continued to expand. Entire mountains of rock were blasted apart, thrown into the air with abandon. In 10,000ths of a second, the explosion broke free to the surface and destroyed everything within 5 miles. In 1,000th of a second, it destroyed everything 15 miles. In 100th of a second, it destroyed everything within 50 miles. And finally, as a full second passed, the explosion's radius settled after creating a gaping hole in the surface of the planet that spanned roughly 70 miles wide and long. Dust and debris rained down as huge chunks of rock littered the air, cast up by the impact. Several large, mountain-sized chunks of earth escaped the atmosphere, blown up with such force. The surface above the underground chamber was a desolate wasteland, hidden and tucked far away from civilization, a place Zero had thought safe. In fact, the entire lesser world of Hani was considered a wasteland planet, occupied only at the edge of its world bridges. It was once considered a sacred zone for the draconic tribes, but was heavily damaged and left desolate after a series of vicious, internal wars. As a result, no lives were taken in the initial blast and the resulting expansion. A figure emerged into the huge cloud of dust, glowing with white light. Arthur Tellman was completely uninjured, his fine robes and open vest not even the slightest bit damaged. Wind magic. Vanish. Whoosh. The huge storm of dust seemed to freeze for a moment. Right after, a huge windstorm shook the air, multiple tornadoes forming. All of the floating dust and debris became sucked into these tornadoes and shot up high into the sky, exiting the atmosphere and moving into chaotic space. The huge torrents of wind cleared an area roughly 30 miles wide, at the epicenter of the explosion. As this dust cleared, the huge scale of the explosion became clear. A hole that was roughly 10 miles deep into the surface of the planet had been bored, spread out along a huge area. The raw explosive power required to obliterate so much dense rock was gargantuan. A few underground rivers began to pour water into the massive crater from the sides or bottom, while exposed veins of rare ores and minerals gleamed. There were even a few geothermal magma veins bursting forth with molten rock, sizzling into the crater. Arthur's body blurred and vanished as he shot forward, however, his eyes zeroing in on something specific. At the very center of this explosion, a creature could be seen. A bruised, burnt figure of a huge lion, shimming with black energy. It stood roughly 60 meters tall, a huge beast that looked tiny in the scale of the crater it stood in. Its formerly majestic, gold and white fur lay covered in burns and injuries, appearing quite pitiful. "Wizard, I stand yet." Zero's voice was harried as he looked at Arthur's glowing form. In the moment right before the explosion, Zero had felt a dangerous premonition in his soul, as if fate itself was guiding him. If he did not return to his divine golden lion, he would die. He followed that feeling and instantly transformed. A mere fraction of a second after, he was hit with the deadliest attack he had ever suffered from. All of his abilities, all of his power, all of it almost failed in the face of the raw explosive might of a single spell from the Wizard King. Your attack failed. Zero continued, his head raised proudly. And so shall you. Divine golden lions were unique creatures. They drew upon the natural energy of reality, and by doing so, through their own natural physique, they had a near limitless supply of energy to use for attacks. Zero had picked up several protective abilities as he absorbed multiple bloodlines. By combining these with his near limitless energy supply, he was barely able to survive Arthur Tellman's explosion. You don't even remember, huh? You were the one that gave me the inspiration for that spell, from the memories of your past life, old friend. Arthur shook his head as he looked down at the huge lion that was raging below him. Zero's entire physical form blurred as he raised his front legs. Above his head, a massive ball of energy formed, made up of gold and white particles that fluctuated. This energy was condensed from the very air itself around Zero, and the unending supply of energy within him, all in a split second. WHOSSH. This attack took only a split second to summon, yet seemed to tire the giant lion greatly, causing its body to tremble from exertion. The golden light that surrounded it trembled in fury, particles shivering and shuddering. A concentrated beam of raw might shot forward, moving at an extremely fast pace. It melted through the air, destroying space itself as it ripped forward. It was the same attack that Sun Wukong had barely deflected, even with his near all-seeing eyes, one that made the hidden injuries the ancient monkey bore grow worse, the sheer effort needed to block the attack requiring an extreme level of skill. An ability only a divine golden lion possessed. Annihilation Beam. Chapter 217 Back. Arthur clasped his hands together right before Zero launched the attack, casting a spell. Creation Magic. Myriad Portal. A shimmering blue portal appeared in the air, between Arthur and Zero. It opened up into a world of white, ethereal fog. Not a moment later, the glowing annihilation beam ripped through space right towards the Wizard King. And then shot into the portal and vanished completely, leaving behind a crackling trail of golden and white energy. Foolish. If you want to stand a chance, you'll actually need to hit me first. Your law of annihilation isn't half bad, though, not when it's paired with this beam attack. Arthur waved his hand casually. The portal vanished and then instantly reappeared. Right as it reappeared, however, a golden beam of energy shot out of it, identical to the one Zero had just fired off. WHOSH. This beam shot downward and slammed into the stunned figure of Zero, setting off another huge explosion that littered the air with dust once more. Zero's proud figure was thrown down, forming a second, smaller crater in the earth. Huge cracks spread out as jagged chunks of rock ripped free, stone shrapnel shooting off into the air. Zero's annihilation beam was an attack that was aligned with his essence and soul, and couldn't seriously injure him. The law he studied, the law of annihilation, was a natural boost to that attack, and as a result, it immediately neutralized the beam when it hit him. The raw force of the attack, however, could not be neutralized. Boom! Blue flames melted into the air as Zero instantly jumped out of the new crater, shooting off 6 separate geysers of dragonfire. Each one of these quaked with power, covering a huge area. Arthur didn't sit and wait for the dangerous flames to hit him. His eyes glowed, as did the halo around his head, as he cast another spell. Water Magic. Pantheon Ocean Spear. Whoosh! 6 100-meter-wide spears of pure, deep blue water merged into existence, hovering near Arthur. He waved his hand forward, commanding the spears. The 6 spears of water shot out rapidly, slamming into the burning dragonfire at 6 specific points. The moment they made contact, the water sizzled and vaporized. The blue flames, however, vanished, neutralized by the magical water. These 6 spears knocked into and covered all of the blue flames, completely wiping them out. The water spears were formed from a special type of dampening water native to the deepest depths of certain water or ocean-based worlds. Grr! Zero didn't give up when he saw this, instead raising his head once more as he yelled out loud. Roar! An extremely loud, supersonic blast of noise shook the air. This blast was concentrated, particles of energy appearing around Zero's face as he yelled. The Hyperion voice ability, a rare power native to the rare Grand Hoop Tiger. When the vocal attack reached the Wizard King, however, it fizzled out as a white barrier appeared around Arthur's skin, blocking it off. Zero's chest heaved as he shook, his injuries slowly starting to take their toll. Even if he had an infinite supply of energy, it still took him time to recover from each attack. Still, his body was already regenerating from the horrifying burns and blows he'd taken, visibly healing. His defensive prowess had increased far beyond the level it used to be, compared to a few months ago when he had first arrived. "You are far too inexperienced." Arthur's voice sounded almost disappointed as he dropped down, flying towards Zero. "And here I thought the Secondborn would prove more of a challenge. I have only used magic thus far." He shook his head as he cast another spell. Creation magic. Heavenly chains. Whoosh! 8 portals emerged into the air, not far from Zero. Each portal rippled in the air, their edges black and splotchy. They led to a world that seemed to be made of pure, white fog, similar to the other portals. When the anomaly saw this, he growled. Immediately, black energy appeared and surrounded him, a protective layer. From the portals, 8 pure, alabaster chains shot forward. Each chain gave off a majestic, golden glow, full of imperial might. Each chain's end contained a sharp and jagged golden spear, several meters long in length. When Zero saw the chains, his eyes widened with horror. However, before the anomaly could do anything, they had already arrived, moving extremely fast. Boom! Crackle! The spears at the end of the chains slammed into the protective black energy that covered Zero. For a good couple of seconds, that barrier of energy held. The chains seemed to quake as they came into contact with them, imbued with energy but still unable to break through. It was a huge clash of energy that took up all of Zero's focus, leaving the divine golden lion frozen. When Arthur saw this, he frowned and tapped on the small, purple ring he wore. It immediately glowed with light. A moment later, the spears glowed with purple light. Boom! They broke through Zero's barrier. In the split second after, they slammed into his tough body and pierced through it. 4 of the chains stabbed into each of his legs, while 2 stabbed into his chest, 1 stabbed into his neck, and 1 stabbed into his lower back. Blood and light spasmed out as Zero slammed into the ground, his entire body pierced through and frozen. The chains wrapped around Zero once, covering his joints and preventing him from making even the slightest motion. Zero's muscles bulged, blood streaming from his huge body as he quaked against the chains, doing everything he could to shatter them. Arthur landed on the ground not far from Zero, shaking his head. These chains were designed to trap and restrain a creature with a divine class bloodline. I worked on this spell for so many years I lost track, all in preparation. His eyes glinted as he snapped his fingers. Zero's huge body spun around and floated into the air, twisting till Zero's face was looked right at Arthur. The two faced off, Zero's chest heaving as blood dripped from his body, while Arthur looked on, completely dispassionate. "I suppose this makes capture number 47 a success." He nodded. He began to fiddle with his spatial ring, bringing out several odd-looking materials. "You are mighty, wizard, but I will never surrender." Zero's voice had lost none of its majesty as the anomaly spoke, wheezing between words. Both of his lungs had been punctured, making it agonizingly painful to speak. His eyes bored into Arthur, glimmering with golden light. "I don't need your surrender. Your abilities are sealed and you can't draw upon the laws of awe." Arthur cut himself off. "You have detonated your soul?" As the dust settled all around them, dispersed to several miles away by their clashes, the Wizard King frowned. He studied the lion in front of him seriously. "That's right, even, you won't be able to escape, space is destabilized." "My death, glorious?" Zero's mouth leaked blood as he grinned. His entire body began to shake, small blips of light starting to float off of it. A sensation of impending doom filled the air as energy began to concentrate on Zero's form, reaching horrifying levels. Reality around them seemed to distort, making it impossible for any portals to be opened. "Huh." The Wizard King rubbed his chin when he saw this. "Well, you got me there. I didn't know you could do that. Your determination is many times stronger than other anomalies." "But," he shrugged, "I wasn't going to kill you, but you have forced my hand. I can't just let you destroy the planet." Arthur clasped his hands together, staring at the quaking divine golden lion one last time. "Goodbye, Zero." Arthur's voice was cold. "Creation magic. Atomic deconstruction." Zero looked the Wizard King in the eye one last time, seeing a figure that was emblazoned, imprinted, onto his very soul. A proud, resilient human that gave off an almost divine feeling. The strongest being he had ever faced. The strongest human in existence. Zero's huge, lion body, the mighty secondborn that boasted incredible strength, the strongest known anomaly to walk the 30,000 worlds. His body froze for a split second, and then fell apart, turning into particles of gray ash. His legs dissipated into dust, his proud mane falling to nothingness, his mighty chest billowing into tiny clumps of gray. The impending feeling of doom vanished, the terrifying energy dissipating as space returned to normal. Zero died. A period of silence reigned. The falling chunks of rock in the far background finished falling, many of them tumbling into the giant crater. Deep rumblings occasionally shook the air, the damage the planet had suffered causing a worldwide earthquake. Arthur took a deep breath as he waved his hand, retracting and dismissing his heavenly chains. He took a few steps forward, looking at the pile of ash that had once been the secondborn. A quiet, unfair death for a being with aspirations of greatness. He bowed his head slightly, his halo vanishing. He then turned around, his eyes steeled as he prepared to leave. A faint hint of exhaustion lurked at just the edges of his eyes, indicating that the battle hadn't been quite as easy and nonchalant as he made it seem. The Wizard King clasped his hands, summoning up the energy to cast a spell. Creation Mag. Abruptly, Arthur froze, cutting himself off and prematurely ending his spell. Slowly, he turned around, light starting to gather around him once more. For, in the midst of Zero's ashes, a figure began to emerge. Particles of light flowed into this figure, drawing on the natural environment to appear. In just a few moments, that figure fully formed, revealing itself. It was a man, wearing a simple set of black pants and nothing else. He was muscular, with a handsome face and piercing blue eyes. He had short brown hair and a strong chin. This man gave off no aura. He gave off almost no energy at all. Despite that, he carried himself with a sense of absolute confidence. As if there was nothing in existence that could cause him to falter. When the Wizard King saw him, a look of sheer horror and disbelief flashed on his face. "No, it cannot be," Arthur stuttered, his eyes wide in shock. "Hello, old friend." Ukelli Shorn smiled, his ancient eyes studying the world around him as he took a deep breath. "It's been a while." The two beings looked at each other silently. The Wizard King face returned to its placid calm state, every hint of shock vanishing as he looked at Ukelli. Arthur's golden halo reappeared, flush on his head as he stared at the man he had once killed, long ago. Gradually, his halo vanished, as did any signs of energy or threat. He calmed down completely, gaining the appearance of a regular human. "How?" Arthur spoke a single word, waving his hand casually. A large, comfortable-looking chair appeared, one he slowly sat down on as he looked at his former comrade. Ukelli laughed out loud as he saw this, stretching his arms. "It took a while, but one of my clones finally stumbled upon someone that was aware of a law I've been hunting for." Ukelli seemed to taste the words as he spoke, as if he hadn't talked under his own will in a very long time. Every action the man made, every word he spoke, seemed perfectly calculated. Despite the lack of energy or threat he gave off, Arthur gave his full and complete attention to Ukelli, never wavering. "It's called the Law of Holy Light. A certain Shade Prince named Isaac was quite adept with it." Ukelli continued to speak. It had been a very long time since he was able to talk using his own body, especially to an old comrade like Arthur Tellman, and the Master Warrior seemed to have no qualms explaining himself. "The memories I gained were incomplete. It seems that soul fragment did not fully transfer over and is straggling somewhere in a mortal's body. Still, it was enough to help me gather my own understanding of it." He shrugged. "The Law of Holy Light. You have practiced a new law?" Arthur blinked, not giving off a hint of emotion. Ukelli smiled again at the question. "Anomalies can study multiple laws. I built their soul spell matrix specifically to help adapt their souls for that. For every one of my clones that dies, I gain a deep understanding of various laws, abilities, and any information they held." Ukelli waved his hand casually. Whoosh! A golden beam of energy shot off into the air, one that ripped through space itself. A beam very similar, but much lesser in scale, to the beam Zero had shot off, just moments prior. A lesser version of the annihilation beam, accessible only through the law of annihilation. The law of holy light is an interesting law. Ukelli looked at his hand for a moment, studying it. It allows you to resurrect from death. When you annihilated Zero, his soul itself was shredded, preventing him from returning to life. My soul, however, I have touched the divine. I have ascended. Ukelli nodded. Even though my soul is split into 88 pieces, each piece is near invulnerable. Only a being that has touched the divine realm would be able to permanently injure it. Zero's death gave me a chance, the huge remnant energy stores he built up supplying me with what I needed. He has achieved his purpose, and now I can begin mine. Ukelli finished speaking for a moment, stamping the ground with his legs. He was rapidly adapting back to his new body, testing out the movement of his arms and legs. Another moment of silence passed as Arthur tried to comprehend everything he was being told. Despite his relaxed demeanor, his heart was pounding at a rapid pace. You planned all of this? Arthur waved his hand. Well, yes and no. I did plan this, but it happened in a way I didn't quite expect. It worked out in the end, but I think I got a bit lucky, Fate and whatnot. Ukelli grinned cheekily with a smile that did not reach his eyes. After a moment, he added one more line. It might not have come to this if you hadn't attacked me back then, while I was in the midst of ascension. Arthur's eyes blazed with light as he stood up. You were drawing upon the world tree's life force to help you. I had no choice, a single misstep could kill trillions. Your preparations caused Asra's death and nearly killed Sun Wukong. His voice was full of anger. You endangered the lives of trillions just so you could seek your version of Perfy. He stopped talking as Ukelli held up a hand, nodding along with him. Arthur, you were right. You did the right thing. The Wizard King's jaw dropped. Ukelli smiled again when he saw this, his eyes tinged with sorrow as he spoke aloud, taking the conversation on a different track. Reality is imperfect, even in the divine realm. Do you know what I found up there, in the heavens? Arthur froze, his eyes wide as he looked at Ukelli. The Wizard King didn't say anything, but Ukelli took it as a cue to continue. The legends are wrong. The heavens are desolate. The divine realm is worthless. There is no God, there is no light, there is no paradise. There is nothing. It was a wasteland, not a holy land, where the weak live a tortured existence and even the mighty live in squalor. Ukelli's words were cutting. The heavens were destroyed in the wars waged by ascenders from other realities, long ago. I became powerful, yes, but a ruler of a wasteland is still a ruler of a wasteland. A god king of nothing, what value is there in that, lacking perfection? He shook his head. Life is a cycle, of both order and chaos, ever repeating. After reaching a state of great power, even then, I found that I could not achieve perfection. A shattered divine realm was incapable of forming what I desired. He sighed sadly, and I realized something. For all my strength, for all my determination, for all my might, His eyes gleamed. I was selfish. I was flawed. I lacked compassion. I lacked tolerance. I lacked pity. I was so caught up in my own desires that I abandoned what was right, what was just, what was fair, what was equal. He spat out the criticisms of himself mercilessly. I was a fool. Arthur Tellman looked at Ukelli in pure, unadulterated shock as Ukelli continued, his voice echoing in the air. Think of the child starving because her mother cannot bring home enough money to buy them bread. Think of the beggar that is scorned, riddled with illness, living a life of solitude and fear. Think of the cripple who does everything right, yet is forced to live as an outcast. How can reality allow any being of perfection to form, when reality itself is so flawed? As I realized that, I reached a simple conclusion. If I want to achieve perfection, reality itself must change. The more Ukelli talked, the more surprised Arthur was. He looked at the ancient warrior in a new light, as if this was the first time he had ever seen him before. Arthur's heart was turning, completely unable to tell what was going on. Never in 1,000 years would he have imagined their meeting going like this. The me of then, the me that risked life in the 30,000 worlds to ascend, was indeed foolish. You were right to kill me, even if I did get lucky and have my soul ascend as I died. Ukelli nodded. I was wrong. Another moment of silence passed as Arthur looked at Ukelli, and Ukelli looked back. Ukelli sighed, and after I realized that, everything changed. His eyes began to glow with dim, gray light, his voice taking on a passionate tone. Arthur, People must be made to see the value of life. Every starving child should be seen as a glorious seed of the future, every ill beggar as a wise elder, every cripple as a brave hero. Only when people truly understand that life has value, only when this reality itself has changed, can perfection truly flourish. It is not I that has failed to achieve perfection. It is reality itself that is holding me back. His words shook the air, booming with confidence as he smiled, raising a clenched fist into the air. That is why I have returned, Arthur. This part of my soul here, it has all of the important memories I need, stored within it. I apologize if my other versions have caused trouble, even I cannot control them. Their memories are incomplete. He shook his head apologetically. Arthur held up his hand, his eyes piercing as he looked at the supreme martial artist. How do you plan on making people see the value of life? Arthur's intelligence was not low. He instantly saw the key issue with Ukelli's argument, going straight to the point. That is not something you can do with a wave of your hand. Ukelli sighed. I knew you would ask about that, Arthur. It is the key part of my goal. It is a task of such enormity, few could bear such a burden. After living for so long in the divine realm, a plan gradually came clear to me. How do you make people see the value of life? He smiled, half sardonically, half sorrowfully. It's simple. You take it away. There are 30,000 worlds in this reality. When I regain all 88 pieces of my soul, I will regain the powers I held back in the divine realm. I will have become a god. His voice began to grow in strength, a righteous aura breaking into the air around him. When I have that, I will sever the 30,000 worlds from the source world. Have you lost your mind? Arthur trembled, unable to hold himself back when he heard that. As he spoke, his hand casually fell to touch the purple ring he wore on his hand. That would kill hundreds of trillions. Every world that is severed would be swarmed with spatial storms. All of reality would perish. Arthur's rebuke was filled with vehemence. No. Ukelli shook his head, holding up a hand. Under my divine guidance, when I am complete, I can shape those storms with compassion. On every planet, on every world, every being will see the might of these spatial storms, but only half of them will suffer its fury. The other half will remain completely unharmed, spared of even the slightest injury. The deaths of the first half will be painless, a merciful and fast ending. Author's note. This bit was inspired, in part, by Europe's infamous Black Plague wiping out half its population and the huge change in outlook that came about as a result, back in 2016 when I originally started planning, well before I posted it to Webnovel. Not by Marvel, Thanos. Doing so will require me to burn the essence of my soul, expanding my senses to encompass all of reality. I may very well perish as a result, but this reality will live on and evolve into one that sees the value of life. He smiled sadly, for only when you know loss can you appreciate what you have lost. Only when you realize the great gift you have been given can you truly understand it. Only when you experience death all around you. He took a deep breath. Only then can you truly appreciate life. And at that time, reality will have changed. Under my divine guidance, it will have shifted and be born anew. One in which perfection may truly arise, where it will be possible to break past the limits of reality through one's own strength. I may never experience that. He paused and then sighed. But if that is the price I must pay, then so be it. Arthur trembled, his body shaking from rage. He was able to control his emotions to minute levels in front of anyone else, yet when he was in front of Ukelli, he always found it difficult. You will bring about a genocide the likes of which have never been seen before, and you call that compassion? He spat his words out, full of scorn. To save the child that has nothing to eat from starvation, to save the beggar that owns nothing from disease, to save the cripple that is treated as nothing from Tortia's scorn. Yes, Ukelli answered without hesitation. I call that compassion. Those that live will survive, and they will flourish. Life will be treated with the value it deserves. Peace and harmony will reign, forgiveness and mercy will fly freely. He quietly added one more line, a calm whisper that sounded off in the air. Perfection will no longer be unachievable. The descendants of this new reality will bear this lesson in their hearts, passing it forward forevermore. This shall be a scar reality shall never forget. A shocked silence filled the air as Arthur looked at Ukelli. You are insane. Ukelli turned away, an expression of pain filling his face. Arthur, you are my greatest friend. I know that I have wronged you, but surely, you can see the logic of my words. Only when this reality has understood great loss will it understand the true value of life. The Wizard King took several steps backward, shaking his head all the way. You are wrong, old friend, far more so than you were in the past. Arthur's ring began to glow the purple light, one that surrounded his body. Ukelli sighed again, abruptly changing the conversation. I know you have many of my clones, sealed away. I can sense their location, even from this distance, locked into a space that is connected to the capital of your autarky. Arthur, do not force me. If I charged in to rescue them alone, I'm sure all the contingencies you've laid would be enough to potentially stop me, and perhaps even capture me. Ukelli shook his head, but if I borrow the strength of the draconic tribes, it will only be a matter of time. His eyes began to glow with energy as he turned around. One of my clones has united all of the tribes to fight against my former self. Taking his place is something that would take a matter of hours. Turning them into an army to take down your autarky would take a couple of weeks at most. Arthur remained silent as the purple energy glowed around him. His ring was a special artifact he had made himself, over a period of 100 years. It contained a multitude of powers, one of which allowed him to separate himself from reality and teleport to a preset location, once every 5 years. By doing so, he was effectively invincible, but also unable to respond to any attack or do anything until he finished teleporting to his new location. It was his ultimate safeguard, an extremely powerful tool that he kept on him just in case. It was a one-of-kind artifact. You have built up such a fount of knowledge, a beautiful paradise where trillions live. Why bring unnecessary warfare and violence into their lives? This reality has suffered enough, Arthur. Ukelli looked Arthur in the eyes. You are the one making that choice, Ukelli. The Wizard King's voice was quiet as he replied, his voice echoing as it penetrated the layer of purple energy, barely able to make it through. I am doing what must be done, Arthur. What I have to do. For if I don't, then who will? Ukelli turned away again. This is my destiny, old friend. I have found my purpose. Behind him, Arthur's body shimmered and then vanished completely, teleported away. Leaving Ukelli alone inside a crater filled with death, standing tall as the world around him starting to shiver and shake, the reverberations from Arthur and Zero's fight causing unforeseen side effects. I will break reality itself if I must. Ukelli spoke quietly to himself. One day, you will understand. His voice was somber. You all will. Chapter 218 Bound for Issachar once more. Weeks later, back on Tapra, near the molten core of Tapra, a certain unique anomaly was currently standing up, a huge smile on his face. That went well. Dorian smiled with pleasure as he came to, feeling the results of his meditation keenly. He clenched his fists, his body shivering with energy as he called to mind his energy levels. Dorian, Soul Status, Soul Stage, Lord Class, Pseudo-King, Health, Perfect, Energy, 620,055 628,291. A max of around 630,000 points of energy, huh? He nodded as he saw the figure, knowing it was inherently correct. Not bad, it was far from bad. It was insanely strong for a Lord-class being. Time had passed by Dorian while he was in the midst of meditation, at a pace that felt both fast and slow. He had been immersed fully, the mysteries of the world, the unique laws of the universe, all dancing in his consciousness. In this place, he successfully broke into the middle stage of comprehension for the laws of lust, envy, and greed. As a result, the strength of his soul jumped. It was especially so for the law of greed. That law alone had provided the lion's share of the increase in strength to his soul. It made sense, given that greed was the law basically tailored to enhance the power of one's soul. As Dorian fully came to, he glanced around where he was. The molten core was doing just fine and no one came to disturb him. His key moment of comprehension in a secret place went perfectly fine. No one stumbled upon him and attacked, nor did any of his enemies use this moment to land a surprise blow. It was nothing like some of the books he'd read back on Earth claimed something like this would be like. Ah well, he shrugged, feeling half disappointed. If someone had come to attack, he would have been fully prepared. Still, this was real life, not everything came as he wished. With that last fleeting thought, Dorian maintained his Ifrit form as he began to climb out of the hole that led to the molten core. He hopped from wall to wall, using the draft of sweltering heat to boost his jumps as he quickly scaled up. In no time at all, he managed to reach the top of the entrance area, his ifrit form not the slightest bit bothered by the life-crushingly hot air. As he left, his heart built with excitement. He was ready to continue his journey. Meditation was fun and never boring, but some things simply were more interesting. He emerged to a world of darkness. Oh, it's night. He blinked. It took him a second to realize that. For some reason, he'd assumed it would be daylight when he left. He jogged several dozens meters away from the entrance, leaving behind the ungodly heat. When he got far enough away to feel safe, he then transformed, returning to his sun eagle form. Caw! He let out a quiet shout as he then jumped high into the air, leaving behind a small trail of fire that lit up the night. His eyes flashed with light as he turned in a specific direction, his jade memory letting him know exactly where to go. I'm all done here, time to head to Blizzaria. Whoosh! The only thing left after Dorian flew off was the fading line of fire his sun eagle form gave off, fizzling out like a meteor flying through the sky, disappearing to places unknown. Several hours passed. Dorian's journey across Tapra flew by in what felt like an instant. His sun eagle's form made insane progress and it took only a relatively short period to reach Podor City. He opted not to return to the city. He felt a great deal of nostalgia by being there, the memories of his earlier times returning to him, but he also knew the past was the past. He couldn't get stuck up on it just because he had the opportunity to. It was far more important that he continued making progress. The budding sense of urgency he felt only seemed to be growing stronger, day by day. Once he arrived, he flew directly up the world bridge, skipping over the protective wall that blocked it off without issue. He then directly blitzed through the world bridge. He saw several bands of hunters and gatherers moving about their business, and even a group of warriors that seemed to be headed for Blizzaria in search of treasure. A few hours into his journey, his mouth twitched as he passed over one rather familiar zone. By this point, daylight had returned to the world bridge and it was early morning. The cycle of day and night on the world bridges operated similar to how it did on planets, despite their relatively small circumference, a magical process that was dictated by the laws of the universe. He passed over the place where his and Ukelli's mind had clashed long ago. Instead of flying on his way, Dorian dived down and landed. A frown appeared on his face as he shifted to his human form, his clothes magically appearing on him. He had landed in a small clearing, in the middle of a large forest. From his memory, this was the spot where he killed several hunters that had been torturing and celebrating their torture of an innocent deer. He had originally planned to let them off, but when he eavesdropped and heard how they would continue their actions, Dorian had lost it. He had killed them for that. Ukelli's memories had clashed with my own, tainting my judgment. His frown widened as he stopped in front of one particular tree, looking at it. This was the exact tree he remembered standing behind when eavesdropping on those 4 hunters from dozens of meters distant. Would I have killed them under my own sane mind? Dorian spoke to himself, blinking several times as he thought it over. I don't know. It was a sticky situation. All intelligent life has value. Killing someone is a big decision. He sighed as he rubbed his forehead. He wasn't a vegetarian that would shy away from killing other beasts or creatures for sustenance or energy. However, he also would try to avoid killing fully sentient beings, unless they had committed a vile crime. I should have faked poisoning them, and threatened to come back and check on it years later, or something of that nature. It took him only a few seconds of clear thinking to come up with a solution. If I used my abilities, I could have convincingly faked it, even at the time. Killing them, he shook his head, that was excessive. As he reached this conclusion, he felt a weight rise up from his heart. It was Ukelli's influence that twisted his mind and caused him to kill those men. The Dorian he knew he was would have made another solution work, he was absolutely confident of that. He bowed silently for a few seconds, in the general direction of where those men had died. He couldn't change his actions now. Undoing death was something that was extremely difficult to do even when fully prepared to reform a body, with someone that had just died. He didn't even think it would be possible for him to restore 4 people back to life, even if he had their souls and viable bodies to help reform right now. Bringing back Will and Probus had been difficult enough. With these doubts in his mind settled, Dorian left the forest clearing, returning to his sun eagle form as he went back to his journey. His eyes flashed clearly, not a hint of self-doubt present. He blazed across the rest of the world bridge, making great progress. And, some amount of time later, a calm, but cold breeze brushed past Dorian's face as he looked out from the world bridge, his human eyes gleaming with energy. I'm back. A frozen world spread out around him. The world where the dead walked. Blizzaria. The world bridge provided a type of magical protection until one got very close to the ground of Blizzaria. As a result, Dorian could see the storming winds and thundering lightning that plagued the planet strike and whip all around the world bridge, all while remaining safe near the top of it. He began to jog down the world bridge. As he ran, his eyes scanned the dangerous environment, keeping tabs on everything. The closer he got to the end of the world bridge, the more and more he felt the wind and weather of Blizzaria start to affect him. He ignored that as he ran, picking up speed as he charged forward. He crossed the distance down in seconds, his body blurring due to his great speed. In no time at all, he had almost reached the end. The last time I was here, I was weak. I lacked the strength to stand up for myself. I even had to rely on Ukelli's memories and consciousness at one point, and was almost fatally wounded by a certain fox. As he spoke aloud, his eyes twinkled. Transform. Whoosh. His human body vanished, instantly replaced with a scaled, armored demonic figure that gave off a sense of control and balance. Dorian leapt forward several dozen meters, jumping high into the air, and landed just before the end of the world bridge, where the weather of Tapra was almost fully unleashed. Instantly, a flurry of chaotic winds smashed against him, the deadly weather of the surface trying to overwhelm him. The air whiplashed all around him, blistering cold ice crashing into his scales, freezing rain and wind knocking into his back. You are currently caught within a distorted field storm. Recommendation: leave the distorted field. Asra sent him a notification that he promptly put aside. But I am weak no longer. Dorian completely ignored the weather, not bothered in the slightest as he jumped forward several more times. Soon he completely escaped the bounds of the world bridge and was left with the brunt of the harsh weather. Still, he was unaffected. The worst he felt was the buffeting of the wind, something he could easily ignore. His passive body of balance ability that his balance demon form had instantly rejected any internal changes in temperature, keeping him perfectly fine. He was able to perfectly maintain his sense of balance, moving with clarity. As he fully realized how far he had come, how much stronger and more capable he was now, he couldn't help but grin cheekily. He jogged forward through the dangerous weather, following the trail his memories had left behind. Now then, his eyes gleamed as he looked at what was in front of him after he finished jogging. A huge statue of a dragon lay before him. He could only see part of it, its enormous mouth, its domineering eyes, and a portion of its shoulders, while the rest of it was obscured from even his vision by the constant flurry of ice and snow. The open mouth alone was huge, stretching up nearly 1,000 meters in height, set into a widespread, rocky stone floor and, unsurprisingly, covered in ice. The entire statue appeared to be buried almost entirely in the ground, sunken into a type of depression, shielding the bottom part of it from the brunt of the weather above. It was the same stone carving he'd seen when he'd first entered Blizzaria. He nodded as he remembered this was the entrance to the western cave system in this area. Blizzaria was split up into multiple cave systems, each of them full of shambling undead. This particular statue was called the Dragon's Mouth. Let's get to it. He waltzed inside. The insides of the cave system were identical to his memories. The stone ceiling was roughly 400 to 500 meters above his head, with a few long stalactites hanging from it. The walls were dark brown, coated with clear or light blue ice, and a large number of glowing crystals. Tourmaline rock crystals, right? He smiled as Asra confirmed it. They were a special type of rock that glowed with light, giving the cave system a certain level of visibility. And this all is the Great Road to Issachar. He nodded again, staring down the cavern. It continued on seemingly endlessly, the end of it disappearing from sight into the distance, forming a sort of road. It was more than 100 meters wide, covered in patches of ice and stone. I need to find a desiccated being with a king-class soul spell matrix. I know there used to be a Greycon king down at Issachar. That one-armed giant should be shambling somewhere in this cave system too. As he talked over his plans out loud, Dorian rapidly moved forward. Only a few minutes passed before it happened. A large, 3-meter-tall minotaur appeared in Dorian's vision, coming from a side passageway onto the main roar to Issachar. The creature was covered in black metal plates that seemed to resemble scales, bearing an appearance very similar to Earth's minotaurs, with the head of a bull, a humanoid set of arms and chest, and hooved legs like that of a horse. A deathly aura hung around it as its head stared at Dorian. It wielded a massive, ancient-looking greatsword on its back, a weapon that was easily as tall as Dorian in his human form. For a split second, the two beings stared at each other. Right after that, the undead Graycon let out a roar, gra-r-r-r-r, and then rapidly began to expand, its body swelling to stand 9 meters tall, becoming a towering monstrosity. Species: Graycon, desiccated. Class: Lord Class, early. Maximum energy level: 29,127. The powerful being's greatsword expanded with it, growing to be huge as it charged at Dorian. He recalled that each sword was a special magical artifact that could expand in size when a Graycon expanded. The large being reached Dorian in a split second, roaring out loud as it swung its massive greatsword down with abandon, a blow filled with all of its fury and anger. A blow that Dorian casually ducked to the side of, dodging the Graycon's huge sword swing with a single step. Boom! The sword collided with the cave floor, cracking the stone and shattering a thin layer of ice that covered the ground. As that occurred, Dorian almost slowly punched out with his right hand, his balanced demon form making a clawed fist. Boom! The Graycon's body instantly exploded. Shards of bone and debris scattered out as it was killed. What was left of it collapsed to the floor in front of Dorian. Its magical artifact weapon was obliterated before Dorian could snag it, metal shrapnel pelting the air as it flew through it. The deathly aura that had swarmed over the Graycon vanished into nothingness. Absorb. Dorian absorbed the soul spell matrix of the dead creature from habit, taking in its energy with a casual wave of his hand. "To think you all used to give me so much trouble," he muttered as he stared at the scattered remains of the now permanently dead Graycon. The undead Graycons lived a tortuous existence, from what he knew. For every one he killed, there were billions more to replace that one, spawned into existence by the strange curse that seemed to hold Blizzaria together. "Rest in peace," he muttered as he stared at its dead body, his eyes blazing with energy. "If I get a chance, I'll see if I can alter the curse that forced you all to live such a cursed existence here." He spoke the words aloud as he turned his head back to the front. They were directed not only at the Graycon he had just killed, but at a large group of 12 patrolling Graycons that had just appeared, one and all snorting and growling as they spotted Dorian. Their bodies rapidly expanded to 9, 10, or 11 meters of height, towering brutes that thundered forward, bringing their huge great swords to bear. But for now, Dorian stepped forward. "Allow me to welcome you into eternal sleep." Chapter 219 Discovery. The lesser planet of Hani had transformed after the battle between Zero and Arthur. The resulting crater that Arthur formed had sweeping effects on the rest of the world, causing a large-scale tectonic shift that threw the entire planet into turmoil. The world itself collapsed and reformed, transforming into a jagged, edged exotic world that no longer resembled the planet it had before. Hundreds of thousands of sharp mountains covered the land now, bereft of life. The world bridges that connected to Hani had broken off or were whittled down, only the bare minimum still connecting. Some of them even hovered hundreds of meters above contact, no longer fully connected to the planet. The weather had turned erratic, wind and rainstorms sweeping the globe. In the depths of one of these random mountains, a small spark of light began to flicker. Then it flickered again, and again, and again. Gradually, dozens of sparks flickered. These sparks rapidly began to condense as they flickered at a fast speed until, finally, they combined to form a humanoid body. Gradually, the light faded away, leaving the figure of a man sitting alone in darkness, in the depths of a random mountain range. Up above, a sweeping storm of wind flowed, setting the air back and forth haphazardly. This storm didn't seem to affect the lower regions of this valley, leaving the newly formed man in a state of silence and peace. After a while, the man spoke. "Father, I am free at last." A deep, enthralling voice echoed from the speaker. Gradually, light began to flicker once more, this time around the man's head. A myriad of colors that eventually stopped changing, settling on a single color. A deep, beautiful red. This flickering light slowly stopped flickering, resolving into a solid, tangible image. A complete, glowing angelic halo. To achieve the angelic class is to step beyond the laws of the universe, in preparation to ascend. Zero spoke the words aloud, a smile appearing on his face. To step beyond the law of annihilation. I chose to experience annihilation. His eyes began to glow with red light. It was a risk. My body and soul almost died permanently there. Zero's words echoed out softly. If I failed to immerse myself in the laws of the universe as I burned my soul, merging my consciousness as it was shredded, if I had taken even a single misstep as I broke into the angelic class, if I had been unable to handle giving up everything as my life flashed before me. He reflected out loud to himself, flexing his arms and legs. He was currently in the humanoid form of his unique divine golden lion body. But I succeeded. I have stepped beyond annihilation and returned. My will, Father, is just as indomitable as yours, and I will not be shackled. Not even by you. His voice took on a cold edge. Foolish Zero who let himself get trapped by the Wizard King. Foolish Zero who was sent fleeing by your comrade Sun Wukong. Foolish Zero who mindlessly slaughtered dragons to absorb their growth energy, all according to the subtle whispers you sent through my soul. When Zero said the last part, his voice gained a slightly uncertain tone. Ukelli's touch was so incredibly fine, Zero wasn't actually sure if he was correct. He felt that he was, but he wasn't actually able to sense that. He had only guessed it. How could a fool like me outsmart you? His smile became grim. No one answered Zero as he sat alone, forgotten. Gradually, the sweeping windstorm above began to die down, the clashing sounds fading to the background. Throughout all of this, Zero refused to move. Instead, he maintained a state of meditation, drawing energy towards his body as he focused on his health. He may have returned to life and successfully broken through to the angelic class, but he had still suffered from apparent annihilation. He was able to come back thanks to his overcoming the law of annihilation by his breakthrough, but the horrifying injuries he'd suffered, in both body and soul, were so devastating any other being would have already perished anew. For an angelic class divine golden lion who had access to near infinite natural energy from his surroundings, however, his unique disposition mitigated any chance of death, allowing for a full recovery, given enough time. Considering the state of his body and soul, returning to his full strength would take anywhere from several days to a couple of weeks. I am your slave no longer. Zero whispered, his words full of intent. I will absorb all of the bloodlines you left for yourself. I will allow you to scrape together those split soul fragments, combining as one. And then I will annihilate you, once and for all. For only with your death will I truly be free of the chains you have set upon me. The air around Zero exploded with light as a majestic, angelic aura rippled into the air. You are not the only one that has found their purpose, Father. Back on Blizzaria, crunch, crunch, crunch. The sounds of ice crinkling echoed out methodically as a particularly strong Graycon plodded its way towards the entrance to the Great Road to Issachar. Particles of ice and stone dust flicked into the air as it moved, slowly falling to the ground behind it. Abruptly, this pseudo-king-class Graycon froze. It cocked its head to the side as it looked down the dimly lit cavern that opened up before it, as if curious. A few scant seconds later, a familiar, demonic figure burst free from the cave, yelling out loud while rapidly spinning and holding on to two gargantuan great swords. Woo! Dorian spun around like a tornado as he whipped the two ridiculously large great swords around, slashing them through the air. If the undead Graycon had been alive, its jaw would have dropped in surprise as the extremely odd sight. Before it could react further, Dorian arrived. SHKKK. Dorian was no genius swordmaster, but the raw power behind his spinning was enhanced by both his perfect body ability and multiple powerful laws. The pseudo-king Graycon didn't stand a chance. It was blown apart, ripped to shreds as its scales cracked and shattered. Shards of bone flew out into the air as the corpse literally fell to pieces, killed in a single blow. Huh, Dorian stuttered as he kept spinning, blasting past the corpse. Whoa. His rapid spinning had thrown off his concentration, even more so with the extremely large, and extremely heavy, blades he was spinning. Dorian skipped forward, his arms going out wide as his two great swords began to slam into the ground. The erratic vibrations that arose as a result finally sent the huge weapons tumbling from his fingers, where they rapidly returned back to normal size, and him tumbling to the floor. Thud, thud, Dorian skipped off the stone ground, slamming into it twice before he managed to right himself, laughing all the way. Ahahaha. He shook his head as he skidded to a halt, looking back at the dead Graycon and his still sliding swords. That went a lot better in my head. After he wiped out the group of Graycons that had ambushed him, destroying them all with ease, Dorian made fast progress down the Great Road. He got lucky, or unlucky, depending on one's perspective, and didn't encounter any treasure hunters or expedition forces out exploring Blizzaria. Instead, he was able to quickly race down the road at a fast speed, blowing past any and all opposition. Literally nothing seemed able to stand in his way. He was unstoppable, wiping out enemy after enemy with absolute ease. It was such a stark difference from his first time here, he couldn't help but celebrate. And now, he had arrived at the exit of the long cavern. The cave entrance opened up into the enormous chamber that housed the grand city of Issachar, a chamber known as the Cavern of Ice. This cavern stretched for dozens of miles into several directions, with long stalagmites and stalactites dispersed throughout, creating a huge, relatively open plain. Ice and frost covered large portions of the ground, as did the tourmaline crystals, lighting the area up. A large number of ruins were built into the walls of the Cavern of Ice. Dorian eyed them as he looked to the left and right. He recalled first seeing the king-class giant he was looking for in this area. Dorian rubbed his chin thoughtfully. He waved his hand casually after a moment. Lesser magnetic manipulation. Whoosh! The two blades he'd taken from some of the Graycons he defeated flew up into the air and shot towards him. He snagged both of them skillfully, storing them in his spatial ring right after. He then began to jog off to the side. The cave exit ended in a large outcropping that had a long stone path that led off towards Issachar. Dorian jogged along the edge of this outcropping, towards the stone ruins built into the side of the cavern wall. When he reached the edge of the outcropping, he jumped up high into the air and transformed into his sun eagle form. The frigid cold could barely be felt as the natural heat of his sun eagle form brushed it off, a small layer of steam rising from his feathered body. Dorian flapped his wings hard, flying to the edge of the roof of the cavern, several hundreds of meters up in the air. And then, he began to search for his target. He covered ground at a very fast rate, able to avoid interacting with any enemies as he scanned his environment, flying high up. Even if the trail of flames he left was visible, it was quashed out so quickly by the cold he was practically unnoticeable. For the next hour, Dorian went on patrol, searching every large passageway he saw, following various potential trails in the Cavern of Ice, scanning everything. At one point, he looked over the city of Issachar once more, remembering everything that happened here. Issachar had been an expansive city, with tens of thousands of stone buildings. All of them were oversized, meant for beings quite a bit taller than regular humanoids. Dorian could make out several collections of buildings built into various stalagmites and stalactites, some high in the air while others low to the ground. There didn't seem to be any ground access to the buildings built up into the hanging stalactites. Most of the buildings were a faded gray color and in ruins, often covered with ice. At the center of the city was the magical stream of liquid ice Dorian was very familiar with. It was a waterfall of Gwaran ice, mysterious, magical ice that was frozen to a temperature far below freezing. Just getting too close to the river could freeze a creature to death, let alone getting in it, as he well remembered. It was in this area that he had those fraught encounters with the Shades, with Ariel, with the king-class Graycon. The last time he was here, Issachar had suffered a huge amount of damage from a massive explosion that ripped part of the city to shreds. Now, however, everything was magically restored back to its normal self. The mysterious curse that modulated this land seemed to defy time itself. To his partial dismay, Dorian wasn't able to find the king-class Graycon that had caused him so much trouble here. While the city had been largely restored, the deadly Graycon that had caused half of his problems was nowhere to be seen. It didn't matter too much, in the end. His target was still the same. The infamous, undead, one-armed iron giant of the fallen giant race. The giant was, according to the research he did long ago, a masterful swordsman that, even in death, was still able to grasp hold of the law of cutting, and wielded a gargantuan sword made out of thorin iron. The undead creature was extremely powerful, a terrifying enemy that towered to an absurd height. Dorian felt confident that if he could find it and take it down, he would get exactly what he needed to evolve. And as the hour of hard work and flying finished up, Dorian's effort paid off. Dorian had just emerged from one of the massive side tunnels, taking sharp turns and twists at breakneck speed, relying upon his greatly enhanced reflexes to survive unscathed. Right as he exited, he was greeted with a rather terrifying image. A massive, towering figure that stood a bit more than 200 meters tall, so unfathomably large it made any other creature look diminutive in comparison. The expanded Greycons, even Dorian's expanded dragon or other large forms, would look like infants when compared to the massive figure that towered before him. This figure, as Dorian studied it closely, was a one-armed skeleton covered in ice. Dorian made out a collection of long, pointed horns, and a strange blue glow that was emanating from the eyes of the creature. Wielded in its lone right arm was an extraordinarily large black blade, at least 100 meters long and a half dozen meters wide, with a huge chunk of frozen ice and rock stuck to the end of it. When Dorian fully recognized it, a huge smile appeared on his face, as did a feeling of anticipation. Species: Giant four-horned variant, desiccated. Class: King class, late. Maximum energy level: 2,458,882. Why, hello there, he had found his King class undead. Chapter 220 Lure. After he spotted the King class giant, Dorian dived down to the ground. His Sun Eagle form shifted and twisted as he transformed mid-flight, returning to his customary balance demon form. Thud. He landed on the ground with a resounding thud. The moment he touched down, he activated everything. His perfect body, all of his laws to boost his physique and defense. He instantly went on guard as he steadied himself. His law of lust enhanced his perception of time and speed, allowing him to truly step well beyond the limits of a Lord-class creature. His preparations were warranted. The moment he began to dive, the King-class giant noticed him. Dorian wasn't sure whether or not the creature sensed that he was living, or sensed that he was a threat, but the second that the giant saw him, it began its assault without hesitation. SHKK. Its lone arm twitched, a raw, powerful aura bursting around it as the creature clenched onto its enormous blade. Just a split second later, it brought its huge sword crashing down deceptively quickly, the blade's huge scale making it appear to move slower than it actually was. Back when he first came to Blizzaria, an attack of this speed would have been a mere blur to him, moving far too quickly for him to react. Now, however, damn it, BOOM. The blade smashed into Dorian before he could successfully dodge it, knocking him backwards and sending him flying through the air at a literal supersonic pace, breaking the sound barrier. He shot away from the cavern wall, rocketing towards Issachar. Thud, thud, his body slammed into and obliterated two stalagmites, sending up bits of ice and rock, until he finally crash-landed. Boom! A dozen stone buildings collapsed as Dorian's body blew into and came to a halt in the city of Issachar. Huge chunks of stone shot off into the air, rubble flying left and right. A wave of dust covered the nearby air, the ancient city shivering. In just a couple of seconds, he had flown thousands of meters through the air, knocked back by a brutal attack. The huge giant he was facing down was at the late King class in terms of energy level. However, that was taking into account the fact that it was in a desiccated state. If it had been living, in full health, it would have been a very powerful pseudo-angelic class expert. Its single blade strike also happened to be its most powerful attack. It was a blow it had mindlessly practiced for tens of thousands of years. While its other strikes or attacks might not be absurdly strong, this single blow moved at such an unnatural speed, guided by so many years of practice and a powerful understanding of the law of cutting, that Dorian had been unable to dodge it. However, while Dorian was unable to fully dodge it, he was able to block the brunt of the strike. A protective layer of energy surrounded his body, from his mystic armored body as well as his law of gluttony. When these two combined with his perfect body and already powerful balanced demon form, the biggest portion of the damage was mitigated. The giant's blade attack was terrifying in strength, but, partially due to how ridiculously large its sword was, its attack power was somewhat spread out. This helped Dorian's defenses hold up. The previous him would have been reduced to a spot of flesh and gore. "You're a bit tougher than I thought you would be," he muttered to himself as he pushed a chunk of rubble off his body. The jarring impact had rattled his bones, tearing multiple muscles and causing several fractures. His law of sloth rapidly set about healing the injuries as he forced himself to stand, glaring at the giant. The giant seemed to sense that Dorian wasn't dead. Dorian saw its towering figure in the distance ominously growing larger in his vision as it rushed towards him. It was so tall, it looked as if it was moving in slow motion, yet covered a large amount of ground in just mere moments. Gra-r-r-r-r. A more immediate, nearby roar caught Dorian's attention. Two large, 15-meter-tall Greycons had charged over, their scales glistening in the dim light. Dorian's abrupt entrance to the city had caused a great deal of noise, catching their attention. Each Greycon wielded a huge greatsword, bristling as they yelled and prepared to attack him. "Sorry, I don't have time for you." Dorian waved his hand. Hyperion beam. 6 small black orbs formed next to him, crackling with energy. An instant later, these orbs finished charging and shot forward, laser beams that melted through the frigid air. Boom, boom. The Greycons were fast and strong, both of them Lord-class experts, but his instant attack had left them with no time to react. Each one was instantly skewered by 3 Hyperion beams, killed before they even finished charging at him. Their bodies collapsed to the ground a few meters off from Dorian, hitting it with a thud. He casually absorbed their soul spell matrices as he finished gathering his bearings, turning his focus back to the charging giant. Greycon bodies were sent flying in the distance as the huge creature continued to rush forward. There were hundreds of stray Greycons in the city and patrolling the ground between the cave wall and the city. All of these creatures turned on the huge giant, suicidally assaulting it, to little effect. The giant held an absolute advantage, in size, in skill, and in strength, over all of the attacking Greycons. "There's no chance I can take it in a close-range battle." He wasn't an idiot. With that thought in mind, Dorian took several deep breaths, his eyes flashing. The giant was about 6 seconds from him. In that time, he began to gather a huge amount of energy as one of his passive abilities flared. The "one with nature" ability that he'd picked up from his warping turkey form, a power that allowed him to handle using large numbers of abilities, or repeatedly using the same ability, with ease. "Ha!" Dorian yelled out loud as his eyes blazed with light. Just an instant later, a full 52 separate Hyperion beams formed in the air, the dozens of black orbs infused with his black flames to grant them their ultimate destructive capabilities. The raw concentration of energy caused the air to quake. Forming so many beams stretched the limits of Dorian's concentration. However, in his balanced demon form, with all of his abilities and laws boosting him, he was just barely able to focus and control all of them, creating a veritable army of attacks. The charging giant seemed to sense the threat that was forming as it brought its huge sword out to bear in front of it. It kept running, however, only a couple of seconds away from reaching the city and Dorian. Dorian merely narrowed his eyes in response, zeroing in on the huge creature. He then focused once more, this time on all of his Hyperion beams. The black orbs all quivered, particles of light and energy flying off of them. Then, all as one, the orbs shot multiple, stacking beams forward. 52 black Hyperion beams blasted out through the air, crackling and searing the underground cavern as they melted forward. The Hyperion beams were concentrated and layered in a way that, under Dorian's careful guidance, caused all of their attacks to line up. The resulting impact meant that the 52 Hyperion beam attack, infused with Dorian's black flames, transformed into a large, meter-wide laser of raw, concentrated energy. An attack of devastating potential. The laser beam crossed the air in an instant, aimed at center mass for the towering giant. Smaller Hyperion beams packed a punch, but Dorian didn't think they would be able to seriously injure, or do much at all, to such a huge figure. However, if he combined all of his Hyperion beams into one massive attack, even this enormous giant would be pierced through and sorely injured. The giant, whether drawing from instincts honed over thousands of years or from memories long ago, somehow was able to predict Dorian's attack and protect itself, raising its huge blade to block the blow. The massive artifact was ancient, but also powerful. Boom! The huge laser collided with the giant and slammed him backwards, not only canceling its momentum but causing it to slide back more than 100 meters. The combined Hyperion beam, as Dorian decided to call it, split off into a dozen reflecting lasers when they hit the sword, shooting off in the air and melting into the stone and ice. Some of the deflected lasers seared long tracks into the earth, while others melted through or sliced apart various stalagmites and stalactites. A few even cut apart some charging Gracons. Throughout this all, Dorian kept up the combined Hyperion beam. Instead of just firing at once, he constantly gathered the energy and continuously kept it firing, relying upon his powerful soul to draw everything he needed. The continuing blast forced the giant back 200 more meters, causing it to collide with and destroy several more large chunks of rock. Finally, however, it managed to set its feet, its body creaking as it came to an abrupt halt. Dorian continued firing off his combined Hyperion beam. The giant, however, slowly began to push forward, using its huge sword as a shield. No matter how powerful Dorian's beam was, it seemed unable to penetrate the giant's massive blade. Boom, boom. Stray explosions shook the air as Dorian's deflected lasers continued to wreak havoc in the underground cavern. He accidentally cut the wall to Issachar in half, stray beams splitting dozens of buildings in twain. Inch by inch, meter by meter, the huge giant continued to walk forward relentlessly. Damn! Sweat dripped down Dorian's head from the strain of controlling the combined Hyperion beam. As he saw the results, he couldn't help but curse. Who told your race to be so damn tough? His complaints went unheard as he made a snap judgment. Overpowering it from a distance isn't going to work. He flicked his eyes to the left and right, quickly scanning his environment. When his gaze landed on the magical waterfall of Gwaran ice that was raining down from the ceiling, inspiration struck. With a wave of his hand, the combined Hyperion beam abruptly stopped, the powerful energy laser vanishing as if it had never been. Rocks and stones still shifted and collapsed in the background, the aftermath of Dorian's attack. He then began to sprint towards the center of the city, his body transforming into a blur as he moved rapidly. He had recovered enough from the giant's attack that he could move with ease, his fast regeneration restoring his body to working condition. If Dorian wanted, he could escape from this giant. It would be rather easy, in fact. However, if he fled, he would be unable to obtain the very thing he came to Blizzaria for. With all of that in mind, when he spotted the waterfall of Gwaran ice, an idea had appeared in his mind. The most dangerous aspect when it came to the giant was its attack speed and seemingly indomitable strength. If he could neutralize either one of those, defeating it and releasing it from the curse that trapped the fallen giant here would become much, much easier. It took Dorian approximately 8 seconds to cross the city and reach the general area where the Gwaran ice waterfall fell. He dodged any and all Gracons, using his small figure and deft movements to lose them. He entered a large, open courtyard-like area that stretched for several hundred meters. No other buildings or homes could be seen in this area, a place he had been to before. The only other notable things were the enormous flowing waterfall of ice, and, set in the ground behind this waterfall, the entrance to the underground dungeon where the Gracon king used to dwell. At its front, a large, stone doorway at least 36 meters wide and 12 meters tall, with cut steps leading downward, opened up to a large, locked gate. It was all the same as it had been last time. As he arrived and scanned the huge waterfall, he felt that, for some reason, it was difficult to look straight at. The air around it was distorted. He forced himself to stare at it, studying it in the scant seconds he had. I see. Dorian could see things now that he could not see before, sensing keenly with his powerful soul. The waterfall appeared to be a unique creation that rejected conventional physics. The ice that was flowing was solid, yet moved as a liquid. It was unnaturally cold, such that it could severely harm or even kill someone just by getting too close to it. And as he cast his senses at it, he realized something. The laws of the universe are distorted around it as well. His mouth fell open as he reached an abrupt conclusion. This was a world phenomena, just like the molten core on Tapra. And not only was it a world phenomena, but it was also one that worked in an opposing manner to Tapra's molten core, a place of extreme cold. He would be able to test his meditation theory on his other laws right here. He couldn't help but grin ferociously when he saw this. He had hoped Blizzaria would have something like Tapra's molten core and he hadn't been let down. He just hadn't expected to find it so easily. It had been hiding in plain sight, like a twist of fate. Boom, thud, thud. An explosion and 2 loud thuds caught Dorian's attention as he tossed the stray thought to the side for now, his eyes narrowing as he focused back on the present. The one-armed giant had forced its way into the city and was destroying anything that tried to stop him. A small army of Greycons were throwing themselves at the awe-defying figure and ruthlessly being cut down. The giant made a beeline for Dorian, rushing at him without a hint of hesitation. Dorian smiled when he saw this. He sprinted around the courtyard, dashing towards the waterfall as he raced to put it between him and the immense, charging giant. "Come and get me,"